What would it feel like if the world simply stopped making sound? Not suddenly, not violently, but gradually, like a breath held too long, until even the memory of noise became distant and strange. There were winters on the early American frontier when this happened. Winters when the storms passed and left behind something far more unsettling than wind or cold, a silence so complete, so total, that it changed the very nature of time itself. Imagine waking one morning to discover that every sound has been muffled, absorbed into snow so deep and air so still that your own heartbeat seems like an intrusion. The forests stand motionless. The animals have vanished or gone silent. Even the wind, that constant companion of winter hardship, has abandoned you to stillness. These were not the winters settlers feared most when they built their cabins in the wilderness. They prepared for blizzards, for hunger, for the bone-deep cold that could kill in hours. But no one told them about the quiet, the kind that lasts for weeks, that presses against your ears like water, that makes you question whether the world beyond your walls still exists at all. Before we step into this hushed passage through winter's strangest cruelty, I'd ask one small thing. Press that like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these quiet journeys into forgotten corners will find you again. Drop a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you are right now, what hour it is where you're listening. Some of you are settling into the stillness of late night, others beginning a new day, and some drifting somewhere between waking and rest. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let us begin tonight's drift through the quietest winter's history ever knew. The silence we're about to explore was not the absence of sound. It was a presence, thick, patient, and deeply strange. It settled over isolated cabins and small settlements like a second winter, one that lived inside the first. And for those who endured it, the quiet became harder to bear than any storm. Let us go there now, to those frontier winters when the world went still. You wake in the darkness, and the first thing you notice is what isn't there. No wind rattling the shutters. No branches scraping against the roof. No distant creak of trees bending under snow weight. Just nothing. You lie there for a moment, listening harder, straining for any sound that might confirm the world still exists beyond these log walls. Your own breathing seems unnaturally loud in the stillness. The straw mattress beneath you crackles with each small movement, and you freeze, suddenly self-conscious of the noise you're making in this ocean of quiet. The fire has died to embers overnight. You can see their faint glow across the single room, but even they make no sound, no pop, no hiss, no whisper of flame consuming wood. The silence is so complete that you can hear the blood moving through your ears, a soft, rhythmic pulse that becomes almost deafening when there's nothing else to listen to. You rise slowly, carefully, your joints protesting the cold with small pops that echo in your skull but disappear into the thick air of the cabin. The floor beneath your feet is frozen earth, packed hard over months of winter, and your footsteps produce only the softest padding sound, absorbed immediately into the stillness. There's no echo, no resonance, just sound dying the moment it's born. Moving to the window, you scrape away the frost with your fingernail. Even this gesture, which should rasp and squeak against the ice, seems muted, as if the cold itself has learned to move silently. Through the small cleared space, you see snow, not falling, not drifting, just there, perfectly still in the grey pre-dawn light. The forest beyond should be alive with small sounds, morning birds preparing for the day, branches settling under their burden of ice, small animals moving through the underbrush beneath the snow. But there's nothing. The trees stand like grave markers in a vast cemetery, each one distinct and separate, and the space between them holds only more quiet. You know in some distant part of your mind that this is because of the snow depth, the storms that raged for 3 days last week, or was it 2 weeks ago? Time has become difficult to measure, left behind drifts so high and so densely packed that sound itself cannot escape them. Every noise, every vibration, every small disturbance in the air is swallowed before it can travel more than a few feet. But knowing why doesn't make it less unsettling. Your body expects sound. Your mind anticipates the small audio markers that tell you where you are in space, how large the world around you is, whether danger might be approaching from a distance you cannot see. Without those sounds, the world feels smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because you can only trust what you can see, larger because the silence suggests vast empty spaces stretching in all directions. Distance becomes meaningless. That tree line 50 yards away might as well be 5 miles because there's no way to hear anything that might exist beyond it. You return to the hearth and begin the morning tasks. Building up the fire requires wood from the stack near the door, and you move to retrieve it with practiced efficiency. But even this familiar routine feels strange in the silence. Your hand grasps the rough bark, and the sensation is intensely present. Texture without sound, touch in a vacuum. The wood should scrape against the other logs as you pull it free. It should clunk as you carry it. It should thud when you set it down near the hearth. But the snow has somehow gotten inside everything, or perhaps the cold has changed the very nature of matter, because each sound is dull, brief, dying before it can complete itself. You arrange the wood carefully on the embers. A thin curl of smoke rises, visible but silent. You blow gently on the coals and your breath produces the faintest whisper, but even that seems absorbed by the surrounding quiet. The fire catches reluctantly, as if it too has learned to be subdued in this muffled world. Flame creeps up the new wood with none of the usual crackling joy. It burns, but quietly, almost apologetically. You sit back and watch, waiting for the heat to spread, and in that waiting the silence presses closer. You realize you haven't spoken aloud in 3 days. Or perhaps 4. There's no one to speak to. Your nearest neighbor is miles away, unreachable now through the snow. And speaking to yourself feels like a confession of something you're not ready to admit yet. Instead, you move through your morning routine wordlessly. Water from the bucket near the door, ice on top, liquid beneath. You break the ice with the handle of a wooden spoon, and the crack is sharp but brief, swallowed immediately. The water pours slowly, thick with cold, making only the softest glug as it fills your cup. Breakfast is cornmeal mush, reheated from yesterday. The wooden spoon scrapes the iron pot, but the sound is flat, dimensionless. You eat slowly, chewing carefully, suddenly aware of how loud the sounds of eating are inside your own head. The grinding of teeth, the soft, wet sounds of swallowing, the small movements of your jaw. These are sounds no one else can hear, but they become enormous in the silence, embarrassing somehow, animal. After eating, you dress for outside work. Layers, always layers. The wool coat that hangs by the door. The mittens you knitted last autumn, when the world still had sound in it, when wind still moved through the trees and geese flew overhead, calling to each other. Now there are no geese, no wind, no calls, just the slow, careful process of putting on clothes that rustle softly and then fall silent. The door opens with effort. Snow has drifted against it overnight. Despite the stillness, you push, and it gives reluctantly, moving through the drift with a soft, shoving sound that barely qualifies as noise. The snow compresses but does not crack, does not crunch, does not do any of the things snow is supposed to do. Outside, the silence is even more profound. The cabin had at least the small sounds of your own presence, breathing, moving, the fire muttering to itself. But out here, under the low grey sky, there is nothing at all. The air itself seems frozen in place, unwilling or unable to carry sound even if sound existed. You need to check on the animals, a cow and 3 chickens, kept in a lean-to shelter attached to the cabin's north side. Moving toward them, your feet sink into snow that comes to mid-calf, but there's no crunch, no squeak, no resistance sound. Just the soft, dead compression of your weight against white nothingness. The animals are alive, huddled together in the straw you spread for them days ago. The cow looks at you with patient eyes, its breath visible but silent. The chickens are fluffed against the cold, not moving much, conserving energy. You give them water from the bucket you filled inside, breaking ice again, pouring carefully. The cow drinks with slow, quiet pulls. Even this, warm animal breath, tongue against water, the slight shuffle of hooves in straw, seems dampened, muted, less than it should be. You milk the cow quickly, your fingers stiff with cold even through the gloves. The milk hits the wooden pail with a soft patter that should grow louder as the pail fills, but it doesn't. The sound remains constant, quiet, unresonant. You realize you're hurrying, eager to be done, eager to return to the cabin where at least there are walls around the silence. Back inside, you pour the milk through a cloth to strain it. And then you stand there in the center of the single room, and you don't know what to do with the rest of the day. Wood is stacked, animals are tended, food is prepared. The basic tasks of survival are complete, and it's not even full morning yet. You could sew, there's mending that needs doing, always mending, but the thought of sitting in the silence, pushing needle through cloth in tiny whispers of friction, stitch after stitch after stitch, feels unbearable. The quietness of the work would only emphasize the quietness of everything else. You could read, if you had more than the one book you brought, a Bible worn soft with use. But you've read it so many times that the words no longer surprise you. And reading in silence, with no voice to give the words shape, feels hollow somehow. The scriptures seem to require sound, require the breath of speaking to carry their meaning. So instead, you pace. 5 steps to the wall, turn, 5 steps back. Your footsteps are barely audible even to you. 5 steps, turn, 5 steps, turn. The rhythm of it is soothing in a way, a small pattern in the patternless quiet. 5 steps, turn, 5 steps, turn. Eventually, you sit by the fire and simply wait. For what, you're not entirely sure. For sound to return, perhaps. For the wind to remember how to blow. For some small bird to brave the cold and offer a single note from the frozen forest. For anything to happen that might break this terrible, gentle, suffocating stillness. The fire burns lower, you add wood carefully, quietly. The flames accept it without comment. Hours pass, marked only by the slow movement of grey light across the floor as the sun travels its winter arc somewhere beyond the clouds. You realize you're listening for footsteps that will not come. No visitors can travel in this snow. No one knows if you're alive or dead, and you cannot know the same about them. The isolation was always present. You chose this land, this cabin, this distance from others, but sound used to bridge it, at least in imagination. Wind carried the possibility of voices. Animal sound suggested life continuing elsewhere. Distance was real, but not absolute. Now, though, you might be the only person left in the world. The silence suggests it. Nothing disproves it. You could walk outside and shout, scream, bellow with all your strength, and the sound would die within yards, absorbed into snow and stillness, and no one would hear, no one would come, no one would even know you'd tried. The thought should frighten you, but it doesn't. Fear requires energy, requires sharpness, requires the adrenaline of perceived threat. What you feel instead is a slow, grey weight, not quite sadness, not quite despair, but something more passive and patient. A quiet acceptance that this is simply how things are now, and will continue to be until they aren't, whenever that might come. You eat dinner as the light fades, more mush, a bit of dried meat, chewed slowly until your jaw aches. The chewing sounds, contained entirely within your skull, become a kind of company. You eat longer than you need to, stretching out the meal, because at least while eating there are small sensations, small internal sounds that prove you still exist. After dinner you sit by the fire again and watch the flames. They're brighter now in the darkness, and their movement has a hypnotic quality. Dancing without music, light without sound. You find yourself swaying slightly, unconsciously, as if trying to provide the rhythm that the world has forgotten. You think about speaking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it's only your own. You open your mouth, you draw breath, but then you stop, because what would you say? And to whom? And wouldn't the sound of your own voice in this silence be somehow worse than the silence itself, a reminder of everything that isn't here? Conversation, reply, the back and forth of human exchange. So you stay quiet, and the night deepens, and eventually you bank the fire and return to your bed. You lie in darkness, listening to nothing. Your heartbeat, your breathing. Small creaks from your own body as you settle into position. These are the only sounds in the universe, or they might as well be. Sleep is difficult. Part of you remains alert, waiting for sound, straining for any break in the quiet. But nothing comes. Nothing ever comes. The night continues in its silent way, and somewhere in those small hours, exhaustion finally wins and you drift off. Not into peaceful rest, but into a shallow, unsatisfying unconsciousness that feels less like sleep and more like temporary absence. Morning comes again, exactly like the morning before. Silence. Stillness. The same grey light through the same small window. The same routine of fire and water and food and animals. The same vast quiet pressing in from all sides. And this continues. Day after day after day, the storms that brought the snow are gone, and no new storms arrive to break the pattern. The weather simply exists, cold, still, silent, unchanging. You exist within it, moving through your tasks with mechanical precision, speaking to no one, hearing nothing, waiting without any clear sense of what you're waiting for. Time begins to lose meaning. Is it Tuesday, Sunday, the second week of January or the 4th? You try to mark the days, scratching small lines on a piece of bark with a nail, but you forget sometimes, or you scratch twice in one day by accident, or you lose count and have to start over. The calendar becomes approximate, theoretical. Time is only morning, afternoon, evening, night, 4 positions of grey light and then darkness, repeated endlessly. You notice your thoughts becoming repetitive, circling the same grooves like water, finding the easiest path downhill. You think about summer, about the sounds summer brings. Insects humming, birds calling, wind moving through green leaves instead of bare branches. You think about voices, human voices, the sound of someone saying your name. You think about laughter, though you can barely remember what it sounds like now. Sometimes you catch yourself standing motionless in the center of the cabin, unsure how long you've been there or what you intended to do. The quiet has gotten inside you somehow. It's not just outside anymore, not just in the snow and the forest and the frozen air. It's in your bones, in your breath, in the spaces between your thoughts. You are becoming silence, or silence is becoming you. It's difficult to say which. You try small experiments to break the quiet. You drop a wooden spoon on the floor deliberately just to hear it clatter. But it doesn't clatter, it lands with a dull thud and lies there, mocking you. You hum, attempting a tune you remember from childhood, but your voice sounds strange, rusty from disuse, and the melody dies in the air like everything else. You clap your hands once, sharply, but the sound is flat and brief and somehow disappointing. Not the sharp crack you remember, but something softer, absorbed, defeated. Eventually you stop trying. The silence has won if it was ever a contest. You accept it the way you accept cold, hunger, loneliness, as a condition of existence, unavoidable and patient. You move through your days quietly, economically, speaking only in your head, listening only to the sounds your body makes involuntarily. The animals become your only company, though they offer little comfort. The cow stands and chews and breathes and exists. The chickens huddle and peck half-heartedly at scattered grain. None of them make the sounds you remember from autumn, no lowing, no clucking, no rustle of energetic movement. They too have learned quiet, or perhaps they've always been quiet, and you're only noticing now because there's nothing else to hear. You wonder sometimes if you've gone deaf, if some cold-induced damage has sealed your ears shut from the inside, cutting you off from a world that actually still has sound in it. You test this by putting your fingers in your ears and removing them quickly. Yes, there's a difference, a slight change in pressure and quality. Your hearing works. The silence is real. This knowledge doesn't help. The days continue their slow, soundless progression. You chop wood, though you already have enough. You mend things that don't need mending. You rearrange the few possessions you own, moving them from one spot to another and then back again. You cook, you eat, you sleep poorly, you wake and begin again. And through it all, the silence holds. Not threatening, not evil, not even unkind, just present, patient, absolute. It asks nothing of you. It requires nothing from you. It simply is, and you exist within it, a small sound-making creature who has learned day by quiet day to make almost no sound at all. The world outside continues, you suppose. Snow remains unmelted. Trees stand frozen. The sky maintains its grey uniformity. But you can't know for certain, can you? Without sound to confirm it, without the audio evidence of wind or animal or falling branch, you have only vision. And vision shows you only stillness. A still world might be a dead world, or it might be a world waiting, or it might be a world that has simply forgotten what it was like to move, to speak, to make itself known through sound. You are forgetting too, forgetting what conversation sounds like, what music is, what it means to hear another human voice saying your name. These things fade, not dramatically, but gradually, like colour leaching from cloth left too long in sunlight. One day you realize you can't quite remember the sound of your mother's voice, and then you can't remember the last time you thought about it, and then you're not even sure if you ever knew it at all. The silence is not cruel. That's what makes it so difficult to bear. If it were violent, if it attacked, you could fight it. But it simply exists, neutral and encompassing, and you exist within it. And the days pass, and nothing changes and nothing happens, and there is only the quiet, the endless, gentle, terrible quiet, pressing in from all sides like water, like stone, like time itself. And still, you endure. You wake. You tend the fire. You feed the animals. You eat. You wait. Not for rescue, not for spring, not for anything in particular. Just waiting because that's what living has become. A patient, silent waiting in a world that has stopped making sound, in a winter that feels like it might never end, in a quietness so profound that even hope has learned to hold its breath. Her name was Sarah Pritchard, though the records that mention her are few and scattered like seeds on frozen ground. She appears in a land registry from 1842 in a brief county notation about homestead claims, and in exactly 11 letters, 10 written by her hand, 1 written about her by a distant cousin who came to visit the following spring. These fragments are all that remain of a woman who lived through one of the quietest winters the northern frontier ever knew, and who documented it with a precision that makes the silence almost audible even now, across more than a century and a half. She was 31 years old that winter, widowed 3 years prior when her husband succumbed to fever during the autumn harvest. He left her the cabin they'd built together, 40 acres of partially cleared land, a milk cow, some chickens, and a choice: return east to her sister's family in Pennsylvania, or remain through another winter alone. She chose to remain, though her letters suggest this was less a choice of courage than a choice of stubbornness, a refusal to admit that the frontier had defeated her before she'd truly tested herself against it. The letters she wrote that winter were addressed to her sister Margaret, though few were ever sent. The nearest town with postal service lay 18 miles south, and winter travel made such distances theoretical rather than practical. Instead, Sarah wrote as a form of conversation with herself, dating each entry carefully, maintaining a structure that would later reveal just how thoroughly the silence affected her sense of time and self. October ended normally. Her last letter from that month mentions wind, constant, blustering, the kind that rattled the shutters and made the chimney moan like a living thing. She writes about gathering the last vegetables from the garden, about laying in firewood, about the satisfying sounds of preparation, axe against wood, door scraping shut, the cow lowing to be milked at the same hour each evening. Her prose is practical, efficient, marked by the small confidences of a woman who has learned to live competently alone. The chickens are laying well still, she writes on October 27th. I hear them clucking in the morning like small gossips, telling each other secrets I cannot understand. It is a good sound, Margaret. It tells me the cold has not yet won. November brought the first real snows, but these were accompanied by wind that howled and pressed and made the cabin feel small but secure. She writes about lying awake at night listening to the storm rage outside, feeling almost grateful for its violence because it confirmed the world's continued existence. The wind was proof that things still moved, still changed, still possessed energy and direction. The storms lasted 3 days, according to her careful record, ending on November 8th. What she noticed first, she writes, was not the silence itself but the absence of something she couldn't initially name. She stood at her window that first morning after the storm, looking out at snow that had drifted higher than the window's bottom edge, and felt a peculiar unease that took her several minutes to identify. The wind has stopped, she writes. This should be welcome, as I have spent 3 days unable to tend properly to the animals or even open the door without great effort. But standing here in the stillness, I find I miss its voice. The cabin feels too quiet now. I can hear myself breathing, and it seems somehow impolite, as if I am listening to something that should remain private. The next few letters document her gradual realization that the silence was not temporary. By November 12th, she notes with growing concern that no sounds at all come from the forest. No birds, no animals moving through brush, no branches cracking under the weight of accumulated snow. She ventures outside despite the cold and the depth of the drifts, walking as far as she dares from the cabin, and hears nothing but her own labored breathing and the soft displacement of snow beneath her boots. It is as if, she writes, the world has been packed in wool. Every sound I make seems to die within arm's reach. I called out, Margaret, just to test the air, and my voice travelled no further than I could spit. This should not be possible. Sound is supposed to carry, to echo, to reach beyond the immediate. But here it simply ends, swallowed by snow and cold and something else I cannot name. What follows in the letters is a careful, almost scientific documentation of the silence's effects. Sarah was an educated woman, rare for frontier settlers, and she applies her observational skills to the phenomenon with methodical precision. She describes how her daily tasks change character without their accompanying sounds. Sweeping the floor becomes dreamlike, the straw broom making only the softest whisper against packed earth. Cooking becomes meditative, but also unsettling, as she cannot hear the subtle sounds that usually tell her when food is ready or fire needs tending. By November 20th, her entries grow shorter, more fragmented. The act of writing itself seems to be changing. Where earlier letters contained full paragraphs of flowing thought, now she offers brief observations, statements, without elaboration, as if language itself is being compressed by the surrounding quiet. No wind today. Chicken silent. Cannot remember last sound from outside. Milked cow. She did not make her usual noise, perhaps forgot how. On November 24th, a longer entry resurfaces, but its tone has shifted. She writes about time becoming difficult to track, about looking out the window and being unable to determine if an hour has passed or an entire afternoon. Without the small audio markers that usually structure human perception, birds announcing dawn, wind patterns changing through the day, the distant sound of something falling or moving, time becomes visual only, and winter light is notoriously unreliable for measuring duration. I think it is Thursday, she writes, but I may have lost a day somewhere. Did I mark Wednesday's passing? I have my scratches on the doorframe, one for each day, but when I look at them now they seem uncertain, unreliable. What if I marked 2 days at once, or forgot a day entirely? How would I know? The silence makes everything feel the same, Margaret. Morning is quiet, afternoon is quiet, night is quiet. They blur together like watercolors left in rain. She begins speaking aloud to herself around this time, though she records this habit with obvious embarrassment. At first, she justifies it practically. Speaking aloud helps her remember tasks, organize her thoughts, maintain a sense of forward momentum through the day. But the entries reveal a deeper need. Her voice, even speaking to no one, becomes a form of company, proof that she remains capable of creating sound, even if the world around her has forgotten how. I talk to the cow now, she admits on December 1st. I tell her about Pennsylvania, about my sister's children, about the garden I will plant in spring. She does not respond, of course, but she looks at me with patient eyes while I speak. And this is something. Better than the walls which only absorb my words and give nothing back. The chickens, she notes, have stopped their usual muttering entirely. They sit huddled together in their corner of the lean-to, barely moving, eating little. She worries they are dying, but they continue to live, merely existing, conserving energy, as silent as stones. One lays an egg on December 4th, and Sarah documents finding it with something approaching joy, not because she needs the egg, but because it represents an event, a happening, a small proof that life continues to produce results, even in silence. By mid-December, Sarah's letters reveal a woman struggling not with cold or hunger. She has adequate supplies for both, but with the psychological weight of soundlessness. She describes lying awake at night, listening to nothing, feeling her own heartbeat grow louder and louder until it seems to thunder in her chest. She worries, she writes, that she might be going deaf, that some damage from cold or isolation has sealed her ears from within. But then, she notes, I can hear the small sounds inside the cabin, the fire, my own footsteps, the spoon against the bowl. So my ears still work. It is the world that has gone quiet, not me. Though sometimes I am not sure which would be worse. She develops routines to combat the silence. small rituals that provide structure without requiring sound. She arranges and rearranges her few possessions, the tin plates on their shelf, the tools hanging by the door, the folded blankets on the bed. She counts things obsessively, logs in the woodpile, kernels of corn in the sack, days since the silence began. Numbers become important because they represent order, sequence, proof that time continues even if it no longer feels like it's moving. Christmas passes unmarked except for a brief note. December 25th, perhaps. Ate a bit more than usual. Said a prayer, but heard no echo of Amen. God feels far away when prayers cannot rise. The winter solstice comes and goes, and Sarah notes with some relief that the days are theoretically lengthening now, even if the light remains consistently grey and weak. She clings to this knowledge that astronomical reality continues regardless of whether she can perceive it, that somewhere beyond the silence and snow, the earth still turns, seasons still progress, natural law still governs the universe. By January, her letters show signs of adaptation. The entries become more measured, less anxious. She has stopped fighting the silence and begun, reluctantly, to accept it as a condition of existence rather than an aberration. She describes a strange peace settling over her, not happiness, but something more like resignation, a recognition that she can endure this because she has no other choice. "I think I understand," she writes on January 11th, "why hermits retreat from the world, not because they hate humanity, but because silence becomes familiar after a while. It is not comfortable exactly, but it is consistent. It makes no demands. It does not change or surprise. There is a safety in that, Margaret, even if it is a sad kind of safety." She continues her daily tasks with mechanical precision. Wood is brought in carefully, quietly. Fire is tended. Animals are fed. Food is prepared and eaten without ceremony. She sweeps though the floor is already clean. She sews though nothing needs mending. The days pass in soft grey procession, each one indistinguishable from the last. But beneath this acceptance, her letters reveal something else, a fear she rarely names directly, but that appears in small asides and half-finished thoughts. She fears that when sound returns, if sound returns, she will have forgotten how to respond to it, that the silence has changed her in ways she cannot undo, that returning to a world of noise and conversation and ordinary human exchange will feel like violence after so many weeks of quiet. "What if," she writes on January the 19th, "I have become so accustomed to this stillness that I cannot bear its opposite? What if the first bird song in spring sounds like screaming? What if voices, when they come, are too loud, too intrusive, too much? I worry, Margaret, that I am learning the wrong lessons here, that I am adapting to something I should be resisting." She describes dreams where sound returns suddenly, violently, storms that roar, animals that shriek, voices that bellow, and she wakes from these dreams in relief that the silence remains, unchanged and gentle. This relief troubles her. She knows intellectually that she should want sound to return, but emotionally she has made a kind of peace with its absence, and peace is difficult to surrender even when you know it's unhealthy. By late January, her entries grow sparse again, but for different reasons than before. She writes less because there is less to say. The silence has become normalized, ordinary, unremarkable. Days pass without documentation because nothing happens that seems worth recording. She exists. The cabin exists, the snow exists, the quiet exists. That is all. The letter dated February 2nd is particularly brief. Still here? Still quiet? Beginning to wonder if this is permanent. If snow never melts and sound never returns. If this is simply how things are now, forever. But then, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, she notes with dry humour, A longer entry appears, written with something that might be cautious hope. She has noticed, she writes, that the light is different, not warmer exactly, but stronger. The sun, still hidden behind constant cloud cover, is rising earlier and setting later. The change is measured in minutes only, barely perceptible, but she has been watching so carefully, with such desperate attention, that she catches it. The earth remembers, she writes, even if we forget, even if sound has been lost, the earth remembers its patterns. The days lengthen whether we notice or not. Spring comes whether we are ready or not. This gives me something to hold to, Margaret. Not hope, exactly, but at least certainty that change remains possible. The next week brings her first sound from outside since November. She documents it with the precision of someone recording a miracle. On February 21st, mid-afternoon, while sitting by the window doing nothing in particular, she hears a single, sharp crack from the forest. Wood breaking, perhaps. Ice shifting. A branch finally succumbing to its burden of accumulated snow. The sound is brief, absorbed quickly back into silence. But it happened. She heard it clearly, unmistakably. Sound still exists. The world has not forgotten how to speak. It has only been holding its breath. I wept, she writes, which is foolish. It was one sound gone in an instant, changing nothing, but I wept anyway because it proved something. What exactly, I am not sure, but something. More sounds follow over the next few days, still rare but no longer impossible. Another crack of wood, a shifting of snow on the roof, a faint, distant sound that might be wind beginning to remember itself. Sarah charts these occurrences carefully, noting the time of day and quality of each sound, as if documenting the resurrection of the world. By early March, her letters show a woman emerging from something that was not quite hibernation, but not quite wakefulness either. The silence hasn't ended, not fully, but it has loosened its grip. Small sounds are possible again. The cow makes a soft noise one morning while being milked. One chicken produces a brief, rusty cluck. These are not the full-throated sounds of autumn, but they are sounds nonetheless, and they break the absolute rule of quiet that has governed the winter. Sarah's final letter from that winter is dated March 12th. She writes about hearing wind for the first time in 4 months. Not a howling storm, but a gentle movement of air, a soft sigh moving through the trees. She stood outside for nearly an hour, she records, just listening to it, relearning what wind sounds like, how it carries and shifts and speaks in its many subtle voices. I had forgotten, she writes, that wind has texture, that it is not one sound but many sounds layered together, branches moving, air pushing against surfaces, distance made audible. I stood there weeping again, Margaret, which I seem to do quite often now, and I listened to the wind as if it were the most beautiful music ever composed. She mentions plans to attempt the journey to town within the week if the snow melts sufficiently. She needs supplies, flour, salt, lamp oil, but more than that she needs to hear human voices again to confirm that she can still engage in conversation, that her months of silence haven't permanently separated her from ordinary social exchange. I am afraid, she admits in the letter's final paragraph. Not of the journey, though it will be difficult, but of arriving and finding that I cannot remember how to be among people, that I have forgotten the rhythms of conversation, the give and take of human speech, that I will stand there mute while others talk around me, and I will realize that the silence has won after all, not by keeping me isolated, but by making me unsuitable for anything else. The letter ends there, without resolution or conclusion. It simply stops mid-thought, as if Sarah looked up from her writing and decided she had said enough, or perhaps that some things cannot be fully expressed in words, or perhaps that she was simply too tired to continue. The record picks up again 6 weeks later, not in Sarah's hand, but in a letter from her cousin Elizabeth, who travelled from town to visit once the roads cleared. Elizabeth's letter, addressed to Margaret in Pennsylvania, describes finding Sarah alive and well, thinner than she remembered, but essentially sound. The cabin was orderly, supplies adequate, animals healthy, if somewhat subdued. "She is changed," Elizabeth writes. "I cannot quite say how. She speaks when spoken to, engages in conversation normally enough, laughs at small jokes, performs all the expected social courtesies. But there is something distant in her manner, as if part of her is still listening for something the rest of us cannot hear, or perhaps listening to something the rest of us have forgotten how to notice." Elizabeth describes sitting with Sarah one evening, talking quietly by the fire, when Sarah suddenly raised her hand for silence and sat motionless for several minutes, head tilted, attention focused on something beyond the cabin walls. When Elizabeth finally asked what was wrong, Sarah smiled apologetically and said, "Nothing. I thought I heard the quiet returning, but it was only ordinary silence, the normal kind that comes between sounds. I am still learning to tell the difference." The letter continues with practical matters, supplies Sarah needed, repairs to the cabin that Elizabeth helped complete, plans for planting once the ground thawed. But it returns at the end to that earlier observation, worrying at it like a loose thread. "I think," Elizabeth writes, "that the winter did something to her that cannot be easily undone, not damage exactly, but a sort of rearrangement, as if the silence moved through her and left her internal landscape changed. She is not unhappy, I do not mean to suggest that, but she is different in ways I cannot adequately describe." Sarah Pritchard remained on her frontier homestead for another 11 years. The sparse records show she expanded her land holdings, acquired more animals, even hired occasional help during harvest seasons. She never remarried, though at least 2 proposals are obliquely referenced in county documents. She maintained correspondence with her sister Margaret, but never returned east for visits, claiming the journey was impractical, though others made it regularly. She died in 1853, age 42, from pneumonia contracted during an early spring cold snap. The brief mention in the county death records notes her as a woman of solitary but steady character, well regarded among neighbors, though not close with any. Her cabin, sold at a state settlement, contained the usual frontier possessions, tools, furniture, kitchen items, a few books. But one item puzzled the assessor enough to mention it specifically: a small wooden box containing dozens of small carved wooden pieces, each marked with a single word in careful handwriting, words like wind, voice, echo, laughter, bell, song, thunder, whisper. No explanation was found for these pieces, and their purpose remained unclear. They were sold as a lot with the cabin's other contents, and their current location is unknown. Perhaps they were discarded. Perhaps they sit now in some antique shop or private collection, their significance lost, their origin forgotten. But those words, collected carefully, carved deliberately, preserved intentionally, suggest something about Sarah's experience during that silent winter. Something about learning which sounds matter enough to save, to hold on to mark and remember. Something about a woman who spent 4 months learning to live without sound, and then spent the rest of her life remembering both the terror and the strange peace of that lesson. The records do not tell us if she ever truly readjusted to a world full of sound. They do not tell us if the silence marked her permanently, or if she eventually returned to ordinary hearing, ordinary listening, ordinary engagement with the acoustic environment all humans navigate without thinking. But there is one final fragment discovered much later in Margaret's papers, a brief note, undated, in Sarah's hand, apparently written years after that winter. Sometimes, it reads, "On very still nights when snow is deep and wind has died and the world holds its breath between storms, I can feel it returning. Not the silence itself, but the memory of it, the weight of it, the particular quality of absolute quiet. And I do not know, Margaret, if what I feel then is fear or longing. Perhaps they are the same thing. Perhaps that is what the winter taught me, that fear and longing can exist in the same moment, pressing against your ears, filling the space where sound should be, asking nothing, giving nothing, simply present and patient and waiting for you to decide whether to resist or surrender. The note ends there. No signature, no date. Just words on paper describing an experience that most who heard about it never understood, attempting to explain something that exists beyond explanation. What it means to live through a season when the world forgets how to speak, and what remains inside you afterward, long after sound returns. Sarah Pritchard endured her quiet winter. She survived it, recorded it, lived beyond it. But the silence, it seems, never fully left her. It became part of her internal landscape, a permanent feature of her psychological terrain. Not a wound exactly, not damage, but a presence, patient, unchanging, waiting in the spaces between sounds, reminding her always that quiet is not absence, but its own strange kind of presence. And in the deepest nights, when snow fell thick and wind held still and the world pressed close around her small cabin in its vast white wilderness, perhaps she could hear it still. That particular, unmistakable quality of silence that is more than mere absence of sound. The silence that lives. The silence that waits. The silence that, once you have truly known it, never entirely releases you. Her story is not one of triumph over adversity. She did not conquer the silence or emerge from it transformed into something stronger. She simply endured it, documented it, and carried its memory forward into all her remaining days. And perhaps that is the real story. Not how she survived one winter without sound, but how that winter continued to echo soundlessly through all the years that followed. The records preserve her existence, but not her experience. They note her presence, but not her inner life. She lived, she endured, she died, and she was buried in ground that had once been frozen under snow so deep that sound itself could not escape it. But somewhere in those carved wooden words, in those careful letters to a sister she would never see again, in the way she tilted her head years later to listen for a quiet that wasn't there, somewhere in these fragments we can glimpse what it meant to live through the strangest of winter hardships, not hunger, not cold, not isolation alone, but silence. Complete, absolute, patient silence, and the peculiar, unsettling peace that silence brings when you stop fighting it and learn, reluctantly, to let it in. Silence, when it persists long enough, becomes more than absence. It becomes architecture. It shapes the spaces people build, the objects they make, the words they choose not to say. On the American frontier, the deep winter quiet did not simply happen to people, it changed them. And in changing them, it changed the very nature of the places they created and the lives they lived within those places. We know this not from what was said, but from what was not said, from the structures that remain, from the objects that survived, from the curious gaps in the historical record where sound should be but isn't, where we might expect references to music, noise, acoustic life, and instead find only silence preserving itself across centuries. Consider the cabins themselves, the basic units of frontier dwelling. When we examine their construction today, those few that remain, or their archaeological remnants, we find something unexpected in their design. Not intentional, perhaps, not consciously planned, but present nonetheless. The walls are thick, far thicker than structural necessity alone would require. Logs chosen for maximum diameter, chinked not just adequately but obsessively, gaps sealed with clay and moss and anything else that might fill the spaces between wood. Standard historical interpretation suggests this was about heat retention, and certainly that played a role. But heat can be maintained with less extreme measures. What these walls really created was acoustic isolation. They absorbed sound, they prevented its transmission, they created interior spaces that were remarkably, even unnaturally, quiet. Chambers of stillness within an already still landscape. The windows were small, far smaller than in comparable Eastern dwellings. Again, conventional explanation cites heat loss. But small windows also meant limited acoustic connection to the outside world. Sound could not easily enter. The interior remained sealed, separate, distinct from whatever might be happening beyond the walls. Roofs were built with remarkable thickness, layers of bark, sod, sometimes snow, deliberately packed and maintained as insulation. These roofs did not merely keep out rain and cold, they absorbed sound from above. Footsteps on snow-covered roofs produced no noise inside. Wind could blow across the top of a cabin, and those within might never hear it. The roof became a sound barrier, whether intentionally or not. What we have, then, are structures that function almost as sensory deprivation chambers. Small, enclosed, acoustically dead spaces where external sound could not penetrate, and internal sound found little surface to reflect from. Log walls absorbed rather than echoed. Earthen floors deadened footsteps. Low ceilings prevented sound from rising and bouncing. People built these cabins in autumn when sound still existed normally, when wind and rain and animal calls filled the days. They built them thinking of cold, of survival, of basic shelter. But what they created without realizing it were spaces perfectly designed for silence. Spaces that would not fight the quiet when winter, deep and soundless, came, but would instead embrace it, amplify it, make it total. The design choices that seemed practical in September revealed their true purpose in January. The thick walls that held heat also held stillness. The small windows that preserved warmth also preserved quiet. The heavy roofs that shed snow also shed the memory of wind. Each element of construction, justified by one need, served another need that builders could not have anticipated. They were building shelters, yes, but also instruments for containing and intensifying the silence that would come. Archaeological examination of frontier sites reveals other curious patterns. Among the artifacts recovered from winter settlements, we find remarkably few objects designed to produce sound. No bells, though bells were common in settlements farther east. No rattles or noisemakers, though these were standard in many households for signalling or calling. Few musical instruments, and those that do appear in the record seem to have been seasonal items mentioned in summer or autumn contexts, but absent from winter documentation. This absence is striking. Sound-making objects were not particularly expensive or difficult to transport. They served practical purposes beyond mere entertainment. Yet frontier settlers, particularly those in isolated northern regions, seem to have either not brought such items with them or to have stopped using them after arrival. Perhaps they learned, through that first deep winter, that sound-making objects in a sound-absorbing environment produce nothing but frustration. A bell that cannot ring clearly, a rattle that makes only muffled whispers, an instrument that produces notes that die within arm's reach. Better to have silence that is natural than sound that is broken and inadequate. The disappointment of failed sound, of attempting music and hearing only dead, flat tones, may have been worse than no sound at all. So the instruments were put away, stored in corners, eventually forgotten. The bells were left unhung, the rattles remained still, and the silence expanded to fill the space these objects might have occupied. It became the default state, the expected condition, the only acoustic reality that made sense within those thick-walled chambers. The objects that do survive from frontier winters tell a different story, one of activities designed to be performed quietly. Weaving tools, carving implements, sewing needles and cloth. These are not merely the tools of necessary work. They are the instruments of silent occupation, activities that fill time without filling acoustic space. We find, in preserved frontier cabins, evidence of extensive carving, not just practical woodworking, but decorative carving, elaborate and time-consuming, on furniture, walls, doorframes, utensils. This carving served no survival purpose. It was art, or perhaps meditation. It was also completely silent. A knife cutting wood makes almost no sound, especially in cold air, especially when done slowly and carefully. The rhythmic scrape of blade on wood grain becomes a kind of white noise, a texture rather than a sound, something felt more than heard. The patterns in this carving are worth noting. They are not representations of sound, no birds singing, no musical notes, no imagery suggesting acoustic life. Instead, they are geometric, repetitive, hypnotic patterns that seem designed to occupy the eye the way silence occupies the ear. Circles within circles, lines becoming other lines, patterns that suggest infinity, continuity, the patience required to carve thousands of small identical marks over countless silent hours. This is the material culture of quiet. Objects made in silence, designed for silence, perhaps even about silence in ways their makers did not consciously intend. The very existence of these carvings suggests hours, days, weeks spent in near total stillness with only the whisper of blade on wood to mark the passage of time. Imagine the carver's world, the light from a small window, the cold air, the absolute quiet, the concentration required to make each cut precise, each line straight, each curve smooth, the hand moving, the eye following, the mind emptying into the repetitive motion. No conversation, no music, no sound except breathing and the faint, rhythmic scrape. This was not just making an object, it was inhabiting silence, dwelling within it, learning its contours and qualities through hundreds of hours of wordless concentration. Letters and journals from the period, when they discuss winter at all, reveal linguistic patterns that mirror these physical artifacts. Writers describe winter activities in passive, process-oriented language. Not "I made bread," but "bread was made." Not "I spoke to my husband," but words were exchanged. The active voice diminishes. The self recedes. Language becomes quieter on the page, as if the silence has infected even written communication. The very grammar shifts, becoming more distant, more observational, as though the writer cannot quite claim ownership of actions performed in that soundless environment. Certain words appear with unusual frequency in these documents. Still, steady, quiet, slow. Waiting. These become almost incantatory, repeated across different writers in different locations, as if the vocabulary itself has narrowed to match the acoustic environment, as if there are simply fewer things that can be said about a world without sound, and so the same words circle back again and again. The repetition is not stylistic choice but linguistic necessity. When experience contracts to a narrow band of sensation and activity, language contracts with it. The rich vocabulary of sound, all the words for noise, volume, music, voice, becomes vestigial. What remains are words for the absence of these things, words that circle around silence without breaking it. Other words disappear almost entirely from winter journals. Loud, noise, shout, song. When these words do appear, they are almost always in past tense or future tense, referring to other seasons. The present tense of winter admits no acoustic intensity. Sound, when mentioned at all, is always soft, small, barely there. To write loud in the context of winter would be to lie or to reference something that happened elsewhere, elsewhen. The present moment of deep winter cannot contain loudness, and the language reflects this impossibility. We find references to people forgetting how to describe sounds. One journal entry from 1844 notes, "Tried to write about the wind that once blew here. Could not find the words. Not because I lack education, but because the memory of wind seems unreal now. Did it truly make noise? What kind of noise? I cannot recall with sufficient clarity to describe it." This is linguistic silence, not the inability to speak, but the erosion of language suitable for describing sound. The vocabulary of acoustic experience atrophying from disuse, leaving speakers and writers with increasingly limited tools for discussing anything beyond the immediate, visible, silent present. The writer knows wind exists, knows it made sound, but cannot reconstruct the experience with enough detail to capture it in words. The sensory memory has degraded. The linguistic scaffolding has collapsed. What remains is only the knowledge that something has been lost, but not the ability to articulate what that something was. This represents a profound disconnection from experience, the present becoming so dominant, so all-consuming, that even recent past becomes nearly inaccessible. Some frontier communities developed what might be called silence protocols, informal but widely understood practices for managing the acoustic void. These were not written rules, but emergent social patterns that appear across multiple settlements in similar forms. One such protocol involved the preservation of sound-making tasks for specific times. Chopping wood, for instance, which necessarily produces noise, was often relegated to midday, when light was strongest and the brief interruption of silence felt less intrusive. Morning and evening remained quiet times, preserved for silence as if by mutual agreement. The community learned, without explicit discussion, to schedule their days around acoustic considerations. Necessary noise was consolidated, contained, made as brief as possible. The rest of the day was given over to quiet. This was not enforcement, but coordination, people independently arriving at similar conclusions about how to structure time in a sound-absorbing environment. The midday chopping session became a kind of acoustic punctuation, a brief burst of normal sound that divided the silent morning from the silent afternoon. Another protocol involved the gradual elimination of unnecessary speech. Families learned to communicate through gesture, through established routine, through patterns so familiar that coordination required no verbal exchange. This was not sign language in any formal sense. It was simply the organic development of non-acoustic communication within a sound-absorbing environment. A gesture toward the water bucket meant needs refilling. A particular way of setting down a tool meant done with this task. A glance could convey time to eat, or getting dark, or something wrong. These gestures were not standardized across households. Each family developed their own. But the pattern of developing them was universal. Speech required effort in the silence, required breaking the stillness, required producing sound that felt increasingly unnatural. Gesture was easier. It preserved the quiet. It allowed communication without acoustic disruption, and over time it became preferred. Not just easier, but actually better, more appropriate to the environment, more comfortable than the alternative of speaking. People found they could coordinate complex tasks, share information, express needs and concerns, all without words. Visitors to frontier settlements during late winter often remarked on this wordlessness. One account from 1851 describes arriving at a small homestead and finding the family of 4 engaged in separate tasks, cooking, mending, carving, spinning, without speaking to each other for over an hour. The visitor, attempting to make conversation, found his questions answered with gestures or brief minimal replies. Not from rudeness, he notes, but from what seemed like genuine difficulty in transitioning back to speech after weeks of near silence. They had forgotten, he writes, that talking was something people did. Or perhaps not forgotten, but rather unlearned it temporarily. Like a skill set aside for the season, to be retrieved when weather permitted but unnecessary until then. The family was functional, cooperative, clearly well coordinated in their activities, but they had simply stopped needing speech to achieve that coordination. Words had become optional, then unnecessary, then actually uncomfortable. The visitors' questions, normal social communication in any other context, were intrusions. They demanded acoustic engagement the family had learned to live without. This cultural adaptation to silence extended beyond individual households to entire small settlements. Villages of 8 or 10 families would fall into collective quiet during deep winter, with whole days passing where no voice was raised except in necessity. Church services, when held at all, were described as whispered affairs, where even hymns were hummed rather than sung, as if full voice had become somehow inappropriate or impossible. The communal worship that might involve full-throated singing in other seasons became something different in winter. Prayer was silent. Scripture was read in low tones or not at all. The congregation gathered, yes, but gathered in stillness. Shared faith became shared quiet, and perhaps there was something powerful in that, a sense of collective experience that did not require sound to affirm it. The silence imposed itself on social structure. Hierarchies that functioned through verbal assertion in other seasons became flat and informal in winter. Leadership required action rather than speech. Decisions were made through demonstration rather than discussion. A community elder might show how something should be done rather than explaining it, and others would follow without comment or question. This created, temporarily, a remarkably egalitarian social environment. Without the ability to dominate through voice, through volume, eloquence, or rhetorical skill, traditional power structures softened. The most talkative member of a community in summer might become invisible in winter, while the quietly competent gained influence simply by doing rather than discussing. Authority shifted to those who could demonstrate skill, endurance, practical knowledge. Words counted for nothing when words were rarely spoken. Action counted for everything. And so, winter produced a temporary inversion of normal social order. The verbose lost power, the capable gained it, and the community reorganized itself around acoustic minimalism. Some scholars have suggested this seasonal silence contributed to the frontier's reputation for laconic speech patterns. The stereotypical Western taciturnity, the cowboy of few words, the settler who speaks in brief, understated phrases, may have roots in winters when speaking at all was difficult, uncomfortable, or simply too effortful to maintain. Language, once economized by necessity, remained economical even when necessity passed. People who learned to communicate in 10 words what others might say in 50 continued that efficiency afterward. The silence trained them into brevity, and brevity became cultural habit. The tight-lipped Westerner of popular imagination may be, in part, a product of these silent winters, someone who learned that most speech is unnecessary, that meaning can be conveyed with minimal sound, that talking at length is not sophistication but waste. But there were costs to this adaptation, costs not always visible in the historical record but present in its gaps and absences. Communities that fell too deeply into winter silence sometimes found they could not fully recover. Springs would arrive, weather would warm, but the acoustic life of the settlement remained muted, subdued, never quite returning to the level of sound and speech that had existed before. The silence had become habitual, comfortable even, and the effort of returning to normal acoustic engagement felt burdensome. These communities tended to dissolve within a few years. Families would leave, one by one, citing various practical reasons: poor soil, difficult access, better opportunities elsewhere. But reading between the lines of their departure explanations, another reason emerges. The silence had made the place feel wrong somehow. Not dangerous, not inhospitable in any material sense, just wrong, uncomfortable. A place where sound didn't work properly, where speaking felt unnatural, where the acoustic environment remained broken even after winter ended. Some settlements were abandoned entirely during or immediately after particularly silent winters. Archaeological evidence shows cabins left with possessions still inside, meals partially prepared, as if inhabitants simply walked away mid-routine. These abandonments have puzzled historians, occurring as they did during seasons of adequate food supply and moderate weather, with no apparent crisis to precipitate sudden departure. But if we consider silence as its own form of crisis, not dramatic but erosive, not threatening but unsustainable, these abandonments make more sense. People left not because they were driven out by hardship, but because they could no longer bear the acoustic deadness of the environment. The silence had won, and they surrendered by leaving. What was it like, those final days in a settlement people were about to abandon? Did they speak of leaving, or did they simply understand it through gesture, through shared recognition that staying was impossible? Did the decision happen collectively, or did families independently arrive at the same conclusion? We cannot know. The abandoned cabins tell us nothing about process, only about outcome. People were here, and then they were not. The mystery of these silent winters extends into anthropology and psychology. How does prolonged silence affect human cognition and emotion? We have some evidence from modern sensory deprivation research, but that research involves artificial environments and short durations. What happened to people who lived for months inside naturally occurring silence is less well documented, but no less significant. Contemporary accounts hint at psychological effects: memory disruption, time distortion, difficulty distinguishing between internal thoughts and external events, heightened sensitivity to tiny sounds paired with decreased ability to process normal acoustic levels. These effects appear across multiple sources, suggesting they were common experiences rather than individual aberrations. The human brain expects sound. It uses acoustic information to orient in space, to judge time, to separate self from environment. Remove that information, and orientation becomes uncertain. Space feels strange. Time becomes elastic, unreliable. The boundary between thinking and perceiving grows fuzzy. Some writers describe hallucinating sounds, hearing voices, music, or other acoustic phenomena that could not possibly be present. These auditory hallucinations were not distressing in most accounts. Instead, they were welcomed, even cherished, as breaks in the monotony of silence. One journal entry describes hearing an entire orchestra playing Handel for 3 hours so vividly that the writer could distinguish individual instruments, despite being alone in a cabin miles from any settlement. "I knew it was not real," the writer notes. But it felt more real than reality itself at that moment. More real than the silence, certainly. And when it faded, I wept not because I had experienced something false, but because I had to return to something even more false, a world without music, without sound, without any acoustic texture at all. This suggests that silence, when prolonged, becomes not just uncomfortable, but ontologically disturbing. It violates human expectations about the nature of reality. Our brains are wired to process sound constantly, to use acoustic information for spatial orientation, danger detection, social connection, temporal pacing. Remove sound entirely, and the brain begins to generate its own, filling the void with phantom acoustics because a soundless world feels impossible, unreal, wrong at the most basic perceptual level. The hallucinations were not madness, but adaptation. The mind attempting to restore normal function by creating the sensory input it expected. That these hallucinations were often pleasant, often beautiful, suggests something about the human need for sound that goes beyond practical communication or warning, We need acoustic beauty. We need music, even if only imagined. We need the texture and richness of sound as part of what makes experience feel complete. Without it, even reality itself feels diminished, less than real. The frontier silence was not total, of course. Small sounds remained: breathing, heartbeat, the tiny noises of daily life. But these sounds, rather than relieving the silence, often emphasized it. They were so small, so inadequate, so quickly absorbed, that they served mainly to highlight how much sound was missing. Imagine living in a world where every sound you make dies within feet of its creation, where your voice carries no further than arm's reach, where even shouting produces only a brief, flat noise that vanishes instantly, where the acoustic feedback that normally tells you about the size and nature of the space around you is simply absent. This is not silence in the sense of quiet. It is silence in the sense of acoustic blindness. You lose a fundamental sense, a primary channel of information about the world. And unlike vision, which you can close your eyes against, you cannot close your ears. You cannot stop listening. You can only listen to nothing hour after hour, day after day, until listening itself becomes a form of torture. The ear strains for input that does not come. The brain processes absence. Attention turns inward, or fragments, or fixates on the tiny sounds that do exist until they become overwhelming in their inadequacy. Some frontiersmen and women developed what we might now recognize as trauma responses to silence: panic at unexpected sounds, inability to tolerate normal acoustic environments once returned to them, compulsive talking or noise-making as soon as weather permitted. These responses appear in enough contemporary accounts to suggest they were widespread, if not universal. One particularly striking account from 1847 describes a trapper who emerged from a winter alone in the far north and immediately began hitting a metal pan with a wooden spoon repeatedly for hours, despite the noise obviously disturbing others around him. When asked why, he could only say, "I need to hear it ring. I need to prove it still can." The man continued this behavior for 3 days before gradually transitioning back to normal acoustic tolerance. During those 3 days, he slept poorly, ate little, and spent most of his waking hours producing noise, banging, scraping, dropping objects, anything that made sound, as if he needed to prove to himself that sound still existed, that the world still worked properly, that the silence had not permanently broken something fundamental about reality. This is what the silence did in its most extreme manifestations. It made people doubt the basic nature of existence. It created uncertainty about what was real and what was hallucination. It disconnected individuals from shared sensory experience, isolating them not just physically, but perceptually. When you cannot hear others, cannot hear yourself properly, cannot use sound to verify that the world beyond your immediate vision still exists, what remains of certainty? And yet, paradoxically, some people found the silence transformative in positive ways. Letters and journals describe moments of clarity, insight, or peace that seemed to arise directly from the absence of sound. Without acoustic distraction, attention could focus entirely on visual beauty, tactile sensation, internal thought. The mind, no longer processing constant auditory input, apparently freed resources for different kinds of awareness. Religious and philosophical writing from frontier settlers often emphasizes this aspect. The silence becomes a space for contemplation, for prayer, for what one writer calls listening to the voice of God that speaks beneath all earthly sound. Whether this represents genuine spiritual experience or rationalization of an uncomfortable situation is impossible to determine. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the line between spiritual insight and psychological adaptation is less clear than we assume. Perhaps finding meaning in silence, choosing to interpret it as sacred space rather than deprivation, is both genuine experience and necessary coping mechanism. What seems clear is that silence, when inescapable, forced a kind of adaptation that went beyond mere tolerance. People changed their relationship with sound itself. They learned to value tiny noises that would previously have seemed insignificant. They developed heightened attention to acoustic subtlety. They discovered that silence, while uncomfortable, contained its own information, that the absence of sound could be meaningful in ways they had never previously considered. A world without sound is not a world without information. It is a world where information comes differently, where attention must shift to other channels, where sight, touch, even smell become primary in ways they are not when hearing dominates. And perhaps in that shift, something is gained. Not compensation exactly, but a different way of knowing, a different relationship with environment and experience. This acoustic awareness, once developed, apparently persisted. Frontiersmen and women who had survived silent winters were noted for their acute hearing, their ability to detect and interpret tiny sounds that others missed. Hunters and trackers who had spent winters in deep silence were particularly valued for this skill. They could hear animals moving at remarkable distances. They could identify threats from the smallest acoustic cues. They had learned, through necessity, to extract maximum information from minimal sound. The silence had trained them into new ways of listening, not for loud or obvious sounds, but for the whispers and hints and barely there vibrations that most people filter out as noise. In a world where sound is abundant, we learn to ignore most of it. But in a world where sound is rare, precious, intermittent, we learn to attend to every fragment, every possibility, every ghost of acoustic presence. The skill was valuable practically, but it also isolated. Those with silence-trained hearing existed in a different acoustic universe than others. They heard conversations rooms away. They were disturbed by noises others didn't notice. They could not unhear what they had learned to hear. The gift was also burden. This created a peculiar split in frontier culture. Those who had experienced the deep silence lived in a different acoustic universe than those who had not. They heard things others missed. They were disturbed by noises others found normal. They moved more quietly, spoke more softly, seemed to inhabit sound differently. Occasionally, tensions arose between silence experienced and silence inexperienced settlers. The former would complain about the latter's excessive noise, though what they called excessive might seem perfectly ordinary to Eastern standards. The latter would find the former's quietness unnerving, asocial, even hostile. These tensions rarely escalated to serious conflict, but they created subtle social divisions within frontier communities. Silent winters sorted people into categories, those who had endured and those who had not, those who understood and those who could not, those who lived partially in quiet even after sound returned, and those who inhabited noise normally. The archaeological and historical record preserves these divisions only indirectly, through settlement patterns, through marriage records, showing people partnering with others who had similar winter experiences, through gradual geographic separation of silence-adapted and silence-inexperienced populations. People sought their own kind. Those shaped by silence gravitated toward each other. Those who had never experienced deep quiet remained together. The frontier sorted itself acoustically. By the mid-19th century, as transportation improved and frontier isolation decreased, the phenomenon of silent winters became less common. Communities were larger, closer together, better supplied. Even in deep winter, some level of activity and sound persisted. The absolute stillness that had characterized earlier frontier winters became rare, and then, eventually, impossible. But its effects lingered in culture, language, social patterns, individual psychology. The frontier had been shaped by silence as much as by any other environmental factor, and that shaping left marks that persisted long after sound returned to normal levels. We see it in the architecture that remained. those thick-walled, small-window cabins that absorbed sound even in seasons when sound was plentiful. We see it in the linguistic patterns of frontier communities, the brevity, the understatement, the discomfort with verbose expression. We see it in social structures that valued demonstration over discussion, action over explanation. The silence had been temporary, seasonal, limited to specific times and places, but it had taught lessons that were not temporary. It had changed how people related to sound, to speech, to the acoustic dimension of existence. And those changes, once made, could not easily be unmade. The body remembers. The mind adapts. And adaptation, even to temporary conditions, can become permanent. Even today, in regions that were once frontier, certain cultural patterns persist that seem traceable to those silent winters, a tendency toward quiet in public spaces, an appreciation for silence as something valuable rather than merely absent, a subtle discomfort with excessive noise that goes beyond mere preference into something more fundamental. These are faint echoes now, diluted across generations, mixed with countless other influences. But they are present nonetheless if you know how to listen for them. Or perhaps more accurately, if you know how to listen to their absence, to the spaces where sound is deliberately minimized, to the cultural choices that prioritize quiet over noise, to the persistent sense that silence, properly understood, is not emptiness but its own kind of presence. The frontier silence changed sound itself, not in any physical sense, but in how sound was understood, experienced, valued, and integrated into human life. It made silence meaningful. It made tiny sounds precious. It created an acoustic awareness that had not existed before, born from seasons when sound nearly ceased to exist at all. And in doing so, it left behind a mystery that persists into the present. What exactly did those silent winters do to the people who endured them? How did months without sound reshape consciousness, cognition, emotional life? What was learned in that stillness that could not be learned any other way? The archaeological record cannot answer these questions. The historical documents only hint. The mystery remains, quiet and patient, waiting in the spaces between sounds, in the gaps where acoustic evidence should be but isn't, in the profound and unsettling silence that once settled over the frontier and changed everything it touched. We are left with fragments, suggestions, possibilities, with thick-walled cabins and carved wooden patterns and linguistic brevity, with journal entries that describe something barely describable, with abandoned settlements and phantom music and people who forgot how to speak and then remembered only partially. We are left with the knowledge that silence, given time and depth and continuity, becomes more than absence. It becomes presence. It becomes teacher. It becomes a force that shapes culture, psychology, perception itself. And we are left wondering what those frontier settlers knew that we have forgotten, what understanding they developed through their winter stillness, what relationship with quiet they forged in necessity, and perhaps came to value even in freedom. The silence kept its secrets. It absorbed sound, absorbed language, absorbed explanation. It gave back nothing except itself, patient, profound, persistent, waiting always for those who would learn to listen, not for sound, but for the quality of its absence. And perhaps that is the final mystery. Not what the silence was, but what it taught. Not how people survived it, but how it survived in them. Not the historical fact of its occurrence, but its echo, soundless and strange, carried forward through generations who never experienced it, but inherited something from those who did. Something about stillness, something about listening, something about the profound and terrible peace that comes when the world stops making sound and you must continue anyway, finding meaning not in what you hear, but in what you do not, building a life inside quietness, learning that silence is not the opposite of sound, but its own deep country, with its own laws and its own fierce, patient, transforming presence. The cabins still stand in some places, these monuments to acoustic isolation. You can visit them, walk through their small doorways, stand inside their thick walls. And if you are quiet, if you wait, if you let your own noise settle, you might feel it. Not the original silence, which is gone forever, but its ghost. The way these spaces still resist sound, the way they still absorb rather than reflect, the way they still feel somehow like chambers designed for stillness. And you might understand standing there why people changed in these places, why the silence shaped them, why they built lives around absence, around quiet, around the vast and patient emptiness that winter brought, and that, in some deep way, they learned to love, or if not love, then at least to understand as something other than simple lack, as something that had its own substance, its own power, its own strange and undeniable truth. The transformation worked at levels deeper than conscious awareness. Neurological changes, perhaps, the brain rewiring itself to accommodate prolonged acoustic deprivation. Psychological shifts that occurred below the threshold of recognition. People did not necessarily know they were changing, they simply were. And the changes were not reversible, not entirely. You cannot unhear silence once you have learned to hear it. You cannot return fully to the acoustic innocence of someone who has never experienced profound stillness. The frontier settlers who survived silent winters carried that experience forward into all subsequent seasons. Spring would come, bringing birdsong and wind through new leaves and the sound of melting water everywhere. But those who had lived through silence heard these sounds differently than those who had not. They heard them as miracles, as almost unbearable richness after months of poverty. Or they heard them as intrusions, violations of the quiet that had become comfortable. Both responses were common, sometimes alternating within the same individual across hours or days. The return of sound was not simple relief. It was adjustment, reorientation, sometimes trauma of its own kind. One account from 1856 describes a woman who wept continuously for 2 days when spring arrived and birds returned to her settlement. Not from joy, she explained, though joy was part of it, but from overwhelm. The acoustic abundance was too much, too sudden, too intense. She had adapted to silence so completely that normal sound levels felt like assault. Her husband built her a small shelter some distance from the cabin, a quiet place where she could retreat when the noise of spring became unbearable. She spent hours there daily for the first weeks of the thaw. Gradually, she readjusted. But she never, according to her own account, heard the world the same way again. Sounds that others found pleasant, she found jarring. Conversations that others enjoyed, she found exhausting. She had been changed, and the change was permanent, marking her as someone separate from those who had not experienced what she had experienced. These individual transformations accumulated into community patterns. Settlements that had survived silent winters together developed shared acoustic cultures that outsiders found strange or off-putting. Visitors noted the quiet of these places even in seasons when sound should be normal. They remarked on how little people spoke, how soft voices remained, how quickly conversations ended. They described a sense of unease, as though sound itself was somehow unwelcome in these spaces. And perhaps it was. Perhaps communities that had been shaped by silence retained some collective memory of it, some shared sense that quiet was more natural, more right than noise. This was not conscious policy but ambient culture, the way silence had become default, comfortable, preferred even when no longer necessary. The children raised in these silence-shaped communities absorbed these patterns without understanding their origin. They learned quiet as normal. They internalized brevity as proper communication. They developed the same acoustic sensitivities their parents had, not from direct experience of silent winters, but from immersion in a culture that silent winters had created. This represents a form of cultural transmission that operates below language, below teaching, in the realm of ambient expectation and modeled behavior. Children did not need to experience silence to be shaped by it. They only needed to grow up among those who had, and so the effects multiplied, spreading forward through generations, diluting gradually but persisting nonetheless. By the late 19th century, as frontier conditions gave way to more settled life, the phenomenon of truly silent winters had largely disappeared. Communities were too large, too connected, too equipped with sound-producing technologies to fall into absolute quiet. The conditions that had created those profound silences, extreme isolation combined with environmental factors that absorbed sound, became increasingly rare. But the cultural patterns they had established did not disappear with equal speed. The preference for quiet persisted. The discomfort with excessive noise remained. The value placed on brevity in speech, on demonstration over explanation, on silence as something other than absence, these survived long after the conditions that created them had passed. Cultural momentum carried forward behaviors and values whose original context had been forgotten. People in former frontier regions continued to speak quietly, to value stillness, to structure their acoustic environments in ways that minimized noise. They did so without knowing why, without recognizing these as adaptations to conditions that no longer existed. The silence had become tradition, and tradition, once established, develops its own justifications, its own self-perpetuating logic that requires no reference to origin. Modern linguistic studies of Western American English have noted distinctive patterns that may trace to these silent winters: the economy of speech, the prevalence of understatement, the discomfort with emotional expressiveness or rhetorical elaboration. These are often attributed to masculine cowboy culture, to the demands of ranching life, to various cultural factors. But they may have deeper roots. In winters, when speech itself was difficult and silence was the dominant mode of existence, language patterns, once established by environmental necessity, become markers of identity. People speak the way their community speaks, even when the reasons for speaking that way have vanished. And so the frontier silence continues to echo in accent, in vocabulary, in the very structure of how meaning is conveyed, not as conscious preservation, but as living residue, behavior that has outlasted its original cause. Psychological research in the 20th century began to document what frontier settlers had experienced intuitively, that prolonged silence has profound effects on cognition and emotion. Sensory deprivation studies in the 1950s and 60s showed that humans denied acoustic stimulation experience hallucinations, time distortion, anxiety, and fundamental disruption of normal psychological processes. But these studies typically involved hours or days of deprivation, not months. What frontier settlers endured was orders of magnitude more extreme, more prolonged, more total than anything replicated in laboratory conditions. We can only extrapolate from short-term studies to understand long-term effects. The hallucinations reported by frontier journals mirror those produced in experimental settings. The time distortion, the difficulty distinguishing internal from external experience, the heightened sensitivity alternating with decreased tolerance, all these appear in both contexts. But the depth and duration of frontier silence likely produced effects we cannot fully measure or understand, having never recreated those conditions deliberately. Some researchers have suggested that prolonged silence may induce altered states of consciousness similar to those reported in meditation or sensory deprivation meditation practices. The frontier settlers' accounts of clarity, insight, spiritual experience might represent genuine cognitive shifts produced by extended acoustic deprivation. Without sound to process, the brain may reallocate resources to other functions. Attention may become more focused, less fragmented. Internal experience may become more vivid, more accessible, more central. These would be adaptations, responses to unusual environmental conditions, but they might also represent valid alternative modes of consciousness, not pathological, but simply different, with their own advantages and limitations. If this is true, then frontier silence was not merely hardship endured, but experience that opened access to psychological states otherwise difficult to reach. The settlers who found meaning, peace, or insight in stillness may not have been rationalizing discomfort, but genuinely discovering something valuable that acoustic abundance makes inaccessible. This suggests that our modern sound-saturated environment, while comfortable and familiar, may limit certain forms of awareness that silence enables. We have gained much by filling acoustic space with music, conversation, environmental noise, but we may have lost access to psychological territory that requires quiet to explore. The frontier settlers, by necessity, visited that territory, and some of them found it worth visiting. Some even found it difficult to leave. There are accounts of individuals who, having survived silent winters, deliberately sought silence afterward. Trappers and hunters who chose solitary routes through quiet wilderness rather than more social alternatives. Settlers who built their homesteads far from neighbors, farther than safety or practicality suggested. People who seemed to need stillness, who had developed appetite for absence of sound that normal acoustic environments could not satisfy. These individuals were often regarded as eccentric, antisocial, perhaps damaged by their frontier experiences, but their own accounts suggest something different. Not damage, but preference, not inability to tolerate sound, but choice to minimize it. Not social dysfunction, but alternative social values that prioritize stillness over acoustic connection. They had learned, in silence, something they valued more than what noise provided, and they organized their lives to preserve access to that something, whatever it was. The question of what exactly silence offers remains partially unanswered. Peace, certainly, the simple absence of acoustic stress, the reduction of sensory input to manageable levels. But perhaps more than peace, perhaps a kind of clarity that noise obscures, perhaps awareness of subtle signals, internal and external, that sound drowns out. Perhaps connection to aspects of environment or self that require quiet to perceive. The frontier settlers who valued silence were not necessarily escaping from sound. They were pursuing something silence contained, something they had discovered during those long winters and could not find elsewhere. What that something was, they rarely articulated clearly. But they pursued it nonetheless, shaped their lives around it, sacrificed comfort and connection to maintain access to it. The architectural legacy of frontier silence extends beyond individual cabins to settlement patterns and town structures. Communities that formed in silence-prone regions tended toward dispersed rather than concentrated layout. Houses separated by substantial distances, public buildings designed with thick walls and sound-absorbing materials, town plans that minimized acoustic overlap between different activity zones. These were not conscious acoustic designs in most cases, but they reflect learned preferences for spatial organization that reduces sound transmission. Churches from this period show particularly interesting acoustic properties. Many were built with unusually absorptive interiors, wood surfaces that deadened rather than amplified sound, low ceilings, layouts that prevented voice from carrying far. These design choices seem counterintuitive for buildings meant to accommodate communal singing and preaching, but they make sense as products of silence-adapted culture. Communities that had learned to worship in whispers built churches suitable for quiet services. The acoustic deadness was not failure but intention, reflecting values shaped by silent winters. Some of these churches still exist. When you enter them, you notice immediately how quiet they are, how sound seems to vanish rather than echo. Modern congregations sometimes complain about poor acoustics, install sound systems to compensate. But the original builders knew what they were creating, spaces that absorbed sound, that maintained intimacy of scale, that felt more like the cabins where people had learned to worship in silence than like traditional churches where voice was meant to soar and fill large volumes. The graveyards associated with these churches tell their own stories. Headstones from the period often bear minimal inscription, name, dates, perhaps a single word like rest or peace. Not the elaborate epitaphs common in Eastern cemeteries, not poetry or biblical quotation or lengthy sentiment, just the essential information stated briefly, carved shallowly. Even in death, the economy of expression persists. Even in memorial, the silence is honored. And perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps people who had lived through silent winters deserved silent commemoration. Perhaps the absence of words on their stones reflected accurately the absence of sound that had characterized their lives. The economic impact of silence adaptation is harder to trace but nonetheless significant. Communities that developed around silent winters tended towards certain types of enterprise and away from others. Industries requiring verbal coordination, complex manufacturing, large-scale commerce, struggled to establish themselves. But industries compatible with quiet thrived. Trapping, where silence was advantage. Woodworking and carving already practiced skills. Small-scale farming that required minimal coordination between workers. These became the economic base of silence-shaped settlements, not from deliberate planning, but from natural fit between available skills and cultural preferences. Trade networks also reflected silence adaptation. Communities with strong silence culture tended to trade with similar communities rather than with more acoustically normal settlements. They formed economic relationships with those who shared their communication style, their comfort with quiet, their values around speech and sound. This created regional economic patterns that reinforced cultural patterns. Silence-adapted communities trading primarily with each other, forming economic networks that were also cultural networks, united not just by geographic proximity, but by shared acoustic sensibility. The disruption of these patterns came gradually through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Railroads brought sound, the whistle and clatter that could not be absorbed or ignored. Telegraph and telephone introduced communication technologies that violated silence-adapted protocols. Increasing population density made acoustic isolation impossible to maintain. The silence-shaped communities faced a choice: adapt to the new acoustic environment or retreat further into isolation. Some chose adaptation, gradually accommodating to normal sound levels, letting the old patterns fade. Others chose retreat, moving to more remote locations where silence could still be preserved. These latter communities became increasingly isolated, increasingly distinct, eventually evolving into cultural enclaves marked as much by their acoustic environment as by any other characteristic. Some of these enclaves persist today, though rarely recognized as products of historical silence adaptation. Religious communities that emphasize quiet worship. Intentional communities built around minimal sound. Regions where cultural norms strongly discourage loud speech or public noise. These are often explained through religious doctrine, environmental philosophy, or simple regional tradition. But at least some may represent the furthest extension of patterns established by frontier silence, communities still organized around values that winter quiet created generations ago. The question remains, what would we find if we could recreate those conditions? If we placed modern individuals in acoustic environments as deeply silent as frontier winters for similar durations, what would we learn? About human psychology, about consciousness, about the relationship between sound and cognition. The ethical and practical challenges of such research are considerable, but the questions persist. The frontier settlers conducted an inadvertent experiment in extreme acoustic deprivation, and we have only fragmentary data from that experiment. What they learned, what they experienced, what they became, these remain partially mysterious. We have their artifacts and their journals and their changed behavior, but we cannot fully access their subjective experience. We cannot know what silence felt like from inside it, only what it looked like from outside, in its effects and residues. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the deepest truths of silence cannot be spoken, cannot be transmitted through language, can only be known directly. The frontier settlers who tried to write about it struggled with inadequate vocabulary. They circled around something they could not quite name. They gestured toward experience that exceeded description. And in their struggle, in their circling, in their insufficient words, they left us perhaps the truest account possible, the account that admits its own incompleteness, that acknowledges silence as something beyond language, that preserves mystery rather than false certainty. And so we return, always, to the cabins, to the thick walls and small windows and acoustic deadness that persists after centuries, to the spaces that still, somehow, feel different, quieter than they should be, more still, as though they remember what they once contained. You can stand in these cabins and try to imagine it, the months without sound, the slow erosion of acoustic expectation, the hallucinations and adaptations and transformations. But imagination fails. Without direct experience, silence of that depth remains theoretical, abstract. You can understand it intellectually without knowing it experientially. And perhaps that gap between understanding and knowing is itself part of the mystery, part of what makes frontier silence fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. We can study it, we can document its effects, we can trace its legacy through culture and language and architecture. But we cannot, unless conditions change dramatically, experience it ourselves. We live in a world too full of sound, too connected, too technologically saturated to ever approach the silence that shaped frontier life. And so that silence recedes further into history, becoming more mysterious as it becomes more distant, its echoes fading even as our interest in it grows. The frontier settlers live now only in documents and artifacts and these strange, quiet spaces they built. Their experience is lost, or at least inaccessible to us. But something of it persists, in the way certain places still feel quiet beyond ordinary quiet, in cultural patterns that resist full explanation, in the sense when you stand in those old cabins that something happened here, something profound and transforming, something to do with sound and its absence, something that changed people in ways we can see but not fully understand. The mystery waits, patient as silence itself, preserved in thick walls and carved wood and linguistic patterns and the gaps in the historical record where sound should be, but isn't. It waits for those who would seek to understand it, who would stand in these spaces and listen, not for sound, but for the quality of its absence, as for what silence preserves and teaches and transforms. And perhaps in that listening, in that attention to absence, we touch something of what those frontier settlers knew. Not completely, not with the depth and intensity they experienced, but enough to recognize that silence is not nothing, that absence is not emptiness, that the void has substance and meaning and power to change those who enter it with awareness and patience and the courage to let it work its strange and patient transformation. Consider what silence actually is in phenomenological terms. Not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of absence, a positive quality, something experienced rather than simply noted. The frontier settlers learned this distinction through months of intimate exposure. They learned that silence has texture, weight, pressure, that it can be thick or thin, heavy or light, comfortable or oppressive, that it changes through the day and across days, possessing its own rhythm and variation despite consisting fundamentally of nothing, This is difficult to grasp for those who have never experienced prolonged silence. In our sound-saturated world, quiet is brief, intermittent, usually incomplete. We might encounter minutes of relative silence, but almost never hours, and certainly not days or weeks or months. Our silence is always temporary, always penetrated by distant sounds, always existing in context of expected noise. We cannot easily imagine silence as environment rather than interruption, as the default rather than the exception, as something stable and continuous that becomes the frame within which small sounds occur, rather than as gaps between sounds that structure our experience. The frontier silence reversed normal acoustic hierarchy. Sound became the exception. Silence became the rule. And in that reversal, everything shifted: perception, behavior, thought itself. The settlers learned to exist in a world where the fundamental acoustic assumption was stillness, where sound was rare event rather than constant background, where listening meant attending to silence rather than filtering it out. This may represent a different mode of consciousness entirely, not better or worse than sound-oriented consciousness, but different, organized around different assumptions, attending to different signals, structured by different patterns. A consciousness shaped by silence would develop different priorities, different skills, different ways of knowing. It would value different things, fear different things, find meaning in different places. The frontier settlers moved for months at a time between two modes of consciousness: the sound-oriented mode of summer and autumn, the silence-oriented mode of deep winter. This movement was not just adjustment to changed environment, but fundamental shift in how consciousness itself operated. They became, seasonally, different kinds of beings, and the transition between these modes was apparently difficult, sometimes traumatic, always significant. You cannot switch easily between such different ways of being. The movement requires time, effort, often distress. Spring and autumn became transitional periods, liminal times when consciousness shifted from one organization to another. Neither sound mode nor silence mode, but something between, unstable and uncomfortable. The historical accounts of these transitions support this interpretation. Settlers describe confusion, disorientation, emotional volatility during the weeks when sound levels were changing dramatically. They report difficulty making decisions, problems with coordination, a sense of being not quite themselves. These are not mere mood changes, but symptoms of fundamental reorganization of consciousness, the brain restructuring itself to accommodate radically different environmental conditions. Some settlers apparently managed this transition better than others. Those who struggled often eventually left, unable to sustain the repeated shifts between acoustic modes. Those who adapted successfully may have developed unusual psychological flexibility, the ability to reorganize consciousness according to environmental demands without losing coherence or function. This would be a valuable skill, though one produced by necessity rather than choice. The philosophical implications are significant. If consciousness can be organized fundamentally differently depending on acoustic environment, what does this say about the nature of mind? About the relationship between environment and cognition? About the ways that sensory input shapes not just content of experience but structure of consciousness itself? Western philosophy has generally treated consciousness as relatively stable, varying in content but not in fundamental structure. But the frontier experience suggests otherwise. It suggests consciousness is more plastic, more environmentally dependent, more subject to radical reorganization than we typically recognize. The settlers did not just experience different things in winter than in summer. They experienced those things differently through different cognitive structures with different modes of awareness. They were not the same conscious beings in winter that they were in summer, even though they inhabited the same bodies and retained the same memories. This challenges assumptions about personal identity, continuity of self, the nature of subjective experience. If you become cognitively different in different acoustic environments, which version is really you? The summer person who lives in sound? The winter person who lives in silence? Both? Neither? The question is not merely philosophical but practical lived experience for those who underwent these transformations. Multiple accounts describe settlers feeling estranged from their summer selves while in winter, or from their winter selves while in summer. A sense of discontinuity, of being multiple people rather than one continuous person. This was apparently disturbing for many, though some found it liberating. The opportunity to be different, to escape the constraints of single continuous identity. The silence permitted, or perhaps forced, a kind of self-transformation that normal conditions do not allow. The modern implications are worth considering. We live in an era of unprecedented acoustic abundance, sound everywhere, always, at volumes that would have been unimaginable to frontier settlers. We have created an environment so thoroughly saturated with sound that silence, real silence, is essentially unavailable to most people most of the time. What are we losing by eliminating silence from our environment? What modes of consciousness, what ways of being, what forms of awareness have we made inaccessible? The frontier settlers' experience suggests we may have lost more than we realize. Not just quiet as comfortable absence of noise, but silence as environment that enables different cognition, different experience, different relationship with self and world. We have chosen sound over silence, chosen connection over isolation, chosen constant stimulation over periodic deprivation. These are reasonable choices, perhaps necessary choices for the kind of society we have built. But they are choices with consequences, and one consequence may be the foreclosure of psychological territories that silence makes accessible. We cannot know what we are missing, having never experienced it. But the frontier accounts hint at something, some quality of awareness, some mode of being, some relationship with existence that requires silence to develop, and by eliminating silence from our world, we have eliminated access to whatever that something is. Perhaps this does not matter. Perhaps what silence enables is not worth what it costs. Perhaps the sound-saturated consciousness we have cultivated is superior in all meaningful ways to silence-oriented consciousness. But perhaps not. Perhaps we have made an unconscious trade, gaining much but losing something valuable, something we can now barely imagine, something that lives only in historical accounts of people who had no choice but to experience what we have chosen to eliminate. The frontier silence then becomes more than historical curiosity. It becomes a kind of natural experiment in consciousness, a demonstration of human plasticity under extreme conditions, a window into modes of being that our current environment makes impossible. And the mystery at its heart, what exactly those settlers experienced, what they learned, what they became in their silent winters, remains urgent precisely because it is now largely inaccessible. We can read about it, study it, theorize about it, but we cannot easily replicate it, cannot directly experience it, cannot know it from inside. And what we cannot know becomes, inevitably, more fascinating. The frontier cabins stand as monuments to this lost experience. These small, thick-walled, acoustically dead spaces represent a way of being we have largely abandoned. They are not just shelters, but philosophical statements, arguments in wood and stone for the value of silence, for the possibility of life organized around acoustic absence rather than acoustic abundance. They remind us that other ways of being are possible, that consciousness is more flexible than we assume, that environment shapes us more deeply than we typically recognize. And they pose a question we cannot fully answer. What have we gained and what have we lost by choosing the world we have chosen? By filling every space with sound, by eliminating silence, by creating an acoustic environment that makes certain modes of consciousness impossible. The frontier settlers could not have imagined our world, its noise, its connection, its constant stimulation. and we cannot fully imagine theirs, its silence, its isolation, its profound and transforming stillness. We are separated not just by time, but by fundamental differences in how consciousness itself operates. And in that separation lies the mystery, permanent, irreducible, waiting in the thick-walled cabins and the gaps in the historical record and the strange, persistent quiet of places that still, somehow, remember what it was to be shaped by silence. While silence settled over isolated cabins and small frontier settlements, spreading its particular weight across the lives of those who had no choice but to endure it, other winters were unfolding elsewhere. Winters marked not by absence of sound, but by its deliberate, structured, continuous presence. The contrast was not merely geographical. It was a matter of privilege, of position, of which side of an invisible line a person happened to occupy when the snow began to fall. Consider the military forts that dotted the frontier's edge, those fortified islands of institutional order in a vast sea of wilderness. Fort Snelling perched at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, Fort Kearny guarding the Oregon Trail, Fort Laramie standing sentinel over the westward routes. These and dozens of others maintained their routines through the deepest winters with a commitment to sound that bordered on obsessive. Morning began with bells. Brass bells rung at precise hours, their tones carrying across parade grounds and through barracks corridors, announcing the day's official start whether anyone wished to hear it or not. These bells were not suggestions. They were commands, acoustic imperatives that organized time and behavior with mechanical precision. After the bells came the drums. Military drums beating reveille, their rhythm cutting through cold air with a sharpness that no amount of snow could fully absorb. The drummers stood in formation, sticks rising and falling in synchronized patterns, producing sound that was purposeful, declarative, impossible to ignore. Then voices, roll call conducted at full volume, names shouted and answered, the human voice used not for communication but for demonstration of presence and order. Officers calling commands, soldiers responding in unison, the entire apparatus of military discipline expressing itself through organized noise. The fort operated on acoustic signals throughout the day. Drums announced mealtimes, bugles called formations, bells marked work shifts and watch changes. Even at night, sentries called out at regular intervals, confirming their alertness, their voices echoing across empty parade grounds, maintaining the fiction that sound meant security. Inside the fort, winter was never silent. Barracks held dozens of men in close quarters, and those quarters were deliberately designed to facilitate rather than dampen sound. Wooden floors that transmitted footsteps, walls that echoed rather than absorbed, common rooms where conversation and activity produced constant acoustic background. This was intentional. Military leadership understood, perhaps instinctively, that silence was dangerous to morale and discipline. Silence allowed men to think too much, to dwell on discomfort and isolation, to question the purpose of standing guard in frozen wilderness. Sound, by contrast, provided distraction, structure, proof that the institution continued to function regardless of weather or season. Officers' quarters maintained slightly different acoustic environments, still far from silent, but more controlled. Fireplaces crackled steadily. Servants moved through rooms, producing the small sounds of domestic work. Clocks ticked, marking time with reassuring regularity. Even in sleep, officers were surrounded by subtle indicators that their world was ordered, managed, continuing according to plan. The fort's kitchens produced constant noise, pots clanging, knives chopping, fires roaring, water boiling, cooks calling to assistance. This noise served a dual purpose. It prepared food, certainly, but it also announced preparation, signaled that sustenance was coming, provided acoustic evidence that the institution was caring for its inhabitants. Compare this to the frontier settler boiling cornmeal mush in silence, hearing only the soft bubble of cooking, eating alone, or with family members who had learned not to speak. The settlers' meal was a private, quiet affair. The fort's meal was a public, noisy event, hundreds of men gathering in mess halls, the clatter of plates and utensils, voices overlapping in conversation and complaint, the whole messy acoustic reality of humans eating together. The contrast could not be more stark. For the settler, winter meant acoustic isolation. For the soldier, winter meant enforced acoustic community. Same season, same cold, entirely different sonic worlds. Religious institutions maintained similar patterns of sound through winter, though with different character and purpose. Missions, monasteries, and established churches created acoustic environments that structured time not through military command, but through sacred rhythm. Bells again, but here they mark the canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. 8 times daily, bells announced prayer times, calling the faithful or the obligated to worship. These bells rang regardless of who might hear them, regardless of whether anyone responded to their call. Inside churches and mission buildings, sound took on ritual significance, chanting, always chanting. The human voice raised not in conversation, but in sacred formula, in Latin phrases worn smooth by centuries of repetition. The sound was less important than the act of sound-making, the acoustic offering to a God who supposedly listened even when humans could not. Organs played where organs existed, massive instruments whose pipes produced sound that filled sacred spaces entirely, leaving no room for silence to enter. Where organs were absent, simpler instruments substituted: harmoniums, bells, drums, anything that could produce tones suitable for accompanying worship. Sermons were delivered with particular attention to acoustic projection. Ministers and priests trained to make their voices carry, to fill buildings with words, to ensure that even those in the back rows heard clearly. The sermon was not merely content, it was performance, acoustic event, sound deliberately crafted and delivered. Between services, religious communities maintained lower but still present levels of sound. Footsteps in corridors, doors opening and closing, the rustle of robes, quiet conversation permitted during certain hours. Even meals, though often taken in silence as spiritual practice, included the sounds of eating, pouring cutlery against plates. Compared to the frontier cabin, where a single person might go days without hearing another human voice, the religious institution was acoustically rich almost beyond measure. Sound was continuous, varied, meaningful, structured. It marked time, space, purpose, community. It announced that life continued within sacred order, that winter was merely weather, not fundamental transformation of reality. Urban environments, even small frontier towns, maintained winter soundscapes that isolated settlers never experienced. Horses moved through streets despite snow. Their hooves made dull thuds on packed snow. Their snorts and breathing provided acoustic evidence of animal presence. Wagons still travelled, though less frequently. Their wheels and runners scraped and squeaked. Drivers called to their animals, using voice as tool and command. Businesses continued operation. Blacksmiths' hammers rang against anvils. Mills ground grain when water still flowed or wind still blew. Carpentry shops produced the rhythmic sounds of sawing and planing. Even in deep winter, economic activity generated acoustic byproducts that filled town streets with proof of ongoing human enterprise. Homes in town were different from isolated cabins. Shared walls meant hearing neighbors, their footsteps, their conversations, their children crying, their dogs barking. These sounds might be intrusive, annoying even, but they were also reassuring. They confirmed that you were not alone, that others endured the same season, that human community persisted despite environmental challenges. Town wells became acoustic gathering points. Women meeting to draw water exchanged greetings, news, gossip. Their voices rose and fell in patterns of social exchange. Even the well itself produced sound, rope creaking through pulleys, buckets splashing into water, the hollow echo of containers being filled. Churches anchored town soundscapes, their bells audible across entire settlements. These bells announced not just services but time itself, helping residents structure their days even when snow made visual markers difficult to read. The 3 o'clock bell, the 6 o'clock bell, each one marking passage, confirming continuity, insisting that time moved forward despite winter's attempt to freeze everything in place. For the wealthy, and there were wealthy even on the frontier's edge, in territorial capitals and established trading centers, winter was an entirely different acoustic experience. Their homes were large enough to contain multiple rooms, each room generating its own soundscape. Servants moved through these spaces, their presence announced by footsteps, door openings, the small noises of domestic labor performed by others. Wealthy homes maintained fires in multiple rooms, each one crackling with reassuring warmth and sound. Kitchens were separate spaces, their noise confined but still present. The acoustic evidence that meals were being prepared, that someone was working to ensure comfort and sustenance. Social gatherings continued through winter in wealthy homes, dinner parties, card games, musical evenings. These events were deliberately acoustic: conversation, laughter, the clink of glassware, instruments being played, songs being sung. They were performances of social vitality, demonstrations that winter had not stopped the flow of civilized life. Music was particularly important in wealthy homes: pianos when they could be transported and maintained, string instruments, violins, violas, cellos, wind instruments for those with skill. Music lessons continued through winter, producing hours of practice sounds, scales, exercises, repeated phrases gradually improving. The sound was not always pleasant, but it was always present, filling time and space with evidence of cultural refinement. Books were read aloud in wealthy homes, family members taking turns, voices giving shape to written words. This practice served multiple purposes: entertainment, education, family bonding, but it also produced sound, created acoustic activity where silence might otherwise settle. The reading voice became familiar companion, as regular and reliable as the ticking clock. Servants in these homes were expected to move quietly, but not silently. Their presence needed to be audible enough to confirm work was being done, but not so loud as to intrude on their employer's comfort. This created a carefully calibrated soundscape: the whisper of broom on floor, the soft clink of dishes being washed, the gentle rustle of laundry being folded. The class distinction here was not merely economic, it was acoustic. The wealthy could afford sound, could pay for servants whose labor generated noise, could maintain social networks that produced conversation, could import instruments and entertainment that filled their environments with varied acoustic texture. The poor, by contrast, lived in silence because silence was all they could afford. This acoustic inequality shaped experience in profound ways. A wealthy family might endure winter with mild inconvenience, reduced social calendar, travel restrictions, some increase in isolation. But their daily life remained rich in sound, varied in acoustic texture, structured by the same social and domestic rhythms that governed other seasons. A frontier settler, by contrast, experienced winter as fundamental transformation. The entire nature of existence changed, sound disappeared, time became elastic, social connection ceased. The settler entered a different reality, one that the wealthy might have heard described but could never truly comprehend without experiencing. When representatives of different classes encountered each other after winter, communication sometimes proved difficult. The settler, emerging from months of silence, found normal conversation overwhelming. Too loud, too fast, too demanding. The wealthy listener, accustomed to constant social exchange, found the settler's slow, careful speech frustrating, perhaps even simple-minded. These misunderstandings reinforced existing class prejudices. The wealthy concluded that frontier life made people dull, slow-thinking, inarticulate. They failed to understand that the settlers' communication style reflected adaptation to silence, a learned efficiency of speech that seemed inadequate only in comparison to acoustic excess. The settler, meanwhile, often found wealthy conversation exhausting and pointless, too many words used to say too little, too much noise obscuring rather than revealing meaning. Having learned to communicate in minimal acoustic conditions, the settler had developed appreciation for brevity, precision, significant speech. The social chatter of the wealthy seemed like waste, like sound for its own sake rather than for communication's purpose. Territorial capitals and administrative centers maintained the most extreme contrast to frontier silence. These were places of government, commerce, legal proceedings, all activities that required sound, that functioned through speech and acoustic ritual. Courts convened through winter, judges presiding, lawyers arguing, witnesses testifying. The entire apparatus of law expressed through spoken word, recorded word, public performance of justice. Legislative sessions continued despite weather. Territorial assemblies met, debated, voted. The chamber floors filled with competing voices, procedural language, the acoustic performance of democratic process. Clerks scratched pens across paper, the sound soft but present, marking decisions into permanent record. Government offices remained active. Bureaucrats filed documents, discussed cases, conducted the ongoing business of administration. Their work generated constant low-level sound, conversation, paper shuffling, doors opening and closing, the routine acoustic environment of institutional work. Even jails and courts maintained sound through winter. Prisoners called to each other. Guards made rounds, their footsteps echoing through corridors. The machinery of punishment and control operated with acoustic regularity, bells marking work periods, voices calling counts, the entire system announcing itself through organized noise. For those within these institutions, soldiers, clergy, government officials, the urban wealthy, winter was an inconvenience, not a transformation. Yes, travel became difficult. Yes, certain activities were curtailed. But the fundamental acoustic nature of their existence remained constant. Sound surrounded them, structured their days, connected them to others, confirmed their place within functioning social systems. They endured winter, certainly, but they endured it with acoustic privilege, with bells and drums and voices and instruments, and all the varied sounds that proved they belonged to civilization, to culture, to the organized human world that continued regardless of season. The frontier settler endured winter differently. Stripped of acoustic markers, removed from institutional rhythms, separated from the sounds that normally structure human experience, the settler entered a liminal space where the basic nature of reality seemed negotiable. Time became approximate, self became uncertain. The world reduced to what could be seen and touched because sound, that primary channel of information about what lies beyond immediate perception, had simply ceased to function normally. This created two entirely different winter experiences, two distinct realities existing simultaneously within the same general geography. One reality was loud, structured, socially embedded, acoustically rich. The other was silent, unstructured, isolated, acoustically impoverished almost to the point of sensory deprivation. Historical records tend to preserve the first reality more completely than the second. Official reports, letters from educated correspondents, newspapers from territorial capitals, these sources describe winters that were cold and difficult, but fundamentally normal in acoustic terms. They mention the usual complaints, confinement, reduced travel, boredom, but they do not mention silence because silence was not part of their experience. The second reality, the silent reality, appears only in fragments, in personal journals kept by isolated settlers, in brief mentions in letters that somehow survived, in the occasional observation by travelers who ventured beyond institutional and urban spaces. This reality seems strange, almost fantastical, to those who never experienced it. Surely winter cannot be that quiet. Surely people exaggerate. Surely silence is merely absence, not presence. But for those who lived it, the silence was the defining characteristic of frontier winter. Everything else, cold, hunger, isolation, was secondary. The silence was primary. It changed everything. And it was entirely avoidable if you had money, position, or institutional affiliation. The wealthy spent winter surrounded by servants, music, and social gatherings. The soldier spent winter surrounded by drums, bugles, and mandatory community. The priest spent winter surrounded by bells, chanting, and sacred ritual. The frontier settler spent winter surrounded by nothing, by silence so complete that reality itself seemed to drain away, leaving only bare existence in a world that had stopped making sound. This distribution of acoustic experience along class and institutional lines created lasting divisions that extended beyond winter into all seasons. Those who had endured silence carried it with them, a permanent alteration in how they experienced sound, speech, and social exchange. Those who had been spared silence remained unchanged, unaware that their winter experience represented privilege rather than universality. When spring arrived and frontier settlers traveled to towns or forts, the acoustic shock was sometimes overwhelming. Too many people talking at once, too much noise from animals, vehicles, work activities, the clanging of bells, the shouting of merchants, the general chaos of human community operating at normal volume. Some settlers adapted quickly, grateful to return to acoustic normalcy. Others struggled, finding themselves irritable, anxious, unable to tolerate the noise they had previously accepted without thought. They had been changed by silence, and the change was not always reversible. Urban dwellers and institutional residents rarely noticed these struggles. Why would they? From their perspective, the settlers were simply adjusting to civilization after months in the wilderness. That adjustment might be difficult, but it was necessary, natural, even desirable. The settlers needed to relearn how to function in proper society. What they failed to recognize was that the settlers had learned something in their silence that the fortunate could never know. What existence feels like when stripped to its essentials, when sound and speech and acoustic community are removed, when you must continue living with only the barest threads connecting you to the human world. This knowledge was unsettling. It suggested that much of what seemed essential to civilized life, the constant sound, the endless social exchange, the acoustic richness of towns and institutions, might actually be optional, even unnecessary. That humans could survive, even function, with far less than they typically demanded. This possibility threatened the entire structure of privilege that allowed some to escape winter's silence, while others could not. If silence was bearable, if people could adapt to it, and even find meaning within it, then perhaps the acoustic richness of urban and institutional life was not a necessity but a luxury. And luxuries, once recognized as such, become harder to justify when their distribution is so profoundly unequal. The acoustic divide of frontier winters reflected and reinforced existing social hierarchies. Those with power and resources created environments that maintained sound through all seasons. Those without power and resources endured whatever conditions nature provided, including months of silence that changed them in ways the privileged never experienced and rarely understood. This pattern was not unique to the American frontier. Similar dynamics appeared wherever human societies confronted extreme environments: Arctic regions, isolated islands, mountain villages cut off by snow. Everywhere, privilege expressed itself partly through acoustic control, through the ability to maintain sound when natural conditions would otherwise produce silence. But the American frontier made this pattern particularly visible because the distances involved were so vast, the contrasts so extreme, the transitions so abrupt. A settler could travel from total silence to cacophonous fort in a single day's journey, experiencing acoustic whiplash that made the inequality impossible to ignore. Some settlers, after experiencing this contrast, chose never to return to settlements during winter. They accepted the silence as preferable to the alternative, returning to acoustic chaos, being reminded of their powerlessness, facing the contempt or pity of those who had spent winter in comfort. Better to remain in the quiet, to adapt fully, to make peace with soundlessness, than to oscillate between two irreconcilable realities. Others left the frontier entirely, unable to endure further winters. Knowing that elsewhere people lived through the same season, without experiencing anything like the profound silence that had marked their own endurance, the knowledge that suffering was not universal but rather distributed along lines of privilege made that suffering harder to bear, not easier. The historical record rarely acknowledges this aspect of frontier experience. Standard narratives emphasize individual resilience, frontier spirit, the triumph of settlers over harsh conditions. They do not mention that some conditions were harsher than others by design, that some people suffered in silence while others maintained comfort and sound, that winter was a shared season but not a shared experience. The silence, when mentioned at all, appears as curious detail rather than central fact. Historical accounts note that frontier winters were quiet or isolated, and then move on to other topics: food supplies, building techniques, interactions with indigenous peoples. The acoustic dimension of frontier life remains peripheral, interesting, but not important. Yet for those who lived it, the silence was central. It was the thing they endured. It was what made winter difficult, more than cold or hunger or any material deprivation, and it was distributed unequally, available to some and forced upon others, shaped by class and position and institutional affiliation in ways that reinforced existing hierarchies. The frontier silence created two nations within one nation, those who heard winter and those who did not, those who lived through sound and those who lived through its absence. Same land, same season, same snow covering everything, but utterly different experiences, utterly different realities, utterly different relationships with the most basic human sense of hearing. And when spring finally arrived, melting snow and returning sound, these two nations would meet again, the privileged, who had maintained acoustic normalcy, and the isolated, who had survived months of silence. They would trade accounts of their winters, and they would not understand each other, because they had not truly shared the same season at all. One had endured winter. The other had merely waited through it. One had been changed by silence. The other had been protected from that change. One knew something the other could never know. The other possessed something the first could never reclaim. The divide was acoustic, but its implications extended far beyond sound. It was about power, about privilege, about who got to maintain their normal relationship with reality and who was forced to adapt to something strange and difficult. It was about bells that rang for some and not for others, about communities that persisted for some while others faced isolation, about winters that transformed some lives while leaving others essentially unchanged. The silence marked the settlers. It left them different, separate, carrying knowledge that could not be fully communicated to those who had been spared. And this marking, this separation, this incommunicable knowledge, these became part of what it meant to be truly frontier, truly on the edge, truly removed from the protected center where civilization maintained its acoustic order regardless of what nature might demand. The privileged returned to spring with relief and gratitude, ready to resume normal life. The silent settlers returned to spring with uncertainty and strangeness, no longer entirely sure what normal life meant, carrying within them the memory of months when sound nearly ceased, when the world reduced to vision and silence, when existence continued without acoustic confirmation. Both had survived winter, but only one had truly endured it. Only one had been tested by silence and emerged changed, marked, forever separated from those who would never understand what it meant to live through season after season in a world that had stopped making sound. This was the final inequality, not merely that some suffered while others did not, but that the suffering itself created knowledge, experience, and transformation that privilege prevented. The fortunate remained themselves through winter. The silent became something else, something that did not quite fit back into the spaces they had left, something marked by absence, by quiet, by the profound and terrible peace of living beyond sound's reach. And so the frontier created its hierarchies not just of wealth or land or opportunity, but of experience itself, of who faced the silence and who did not, of who was changed and who remained protected, of whose winters were merely cold and whose winters rewrote the fundamental terms of existence. The bells rang for some. The silence waited for others. And between them lay all the distance in the world, unbridgeable, profound, marked not by what was heard, but by what was not, by the presence of sound for some and its absence for others, by winters that differed not in weather, but in the acoustic reality each person inhabited, alone or together, silent or surrounded, changed or unchanged, marked or spared. Spring did not arrive with announcement. There was no single day when winter ended and warmth began, no clear boundary between silence and sound. Instead, the change came gradually, almost apologetically, as if the world was uncertain whether it still remembered how to make noise. The first sounds were barely sounds at all. A slight drip from the edge of a roof where sun had warmed ice enough to release a single drop of water. The soft creak of a tree branch relieving itself of snow too heavy to hold any longer. These were not the robust sounds of life returning, but rather the tentative whispers of a world testing whether sound was still possible. Those who had endured the silence noticed these tiny acoustic events with attention that bordered on reverence. Each drip, each creak, each barely audible shift in the snow became worthy of note, worthy of acknowledgement, worthy of gratitude. Sound, once taken for granted as the natural background of existence, had become precious through its absence. The settlers stood in their doorways listening. Not for anything in particular, just listening. Remembering what it felt like when the world spoke, when air carried vibrations that meant something, when distance could be measured in sound as well as sight. As days lengthened and temperatures rose above freezing more frequently, the acoustic environment began to rebuild itself. Water flowing somewhere beneath the snow, its voice muffled but present, the occasional crack of ice breaking on a distant stream. Wind returning in brief, tentative visits, moving through bare branches with sounds that were almost melodic after months of stillness. Birds arrived gradually, their songs rusty and uncertain at first, as if they too had forgotten how to produce full voice. A single robin calling from the edge of the clearing. A crow cawing its harsh announcement from a treetop. These sounds, which in autumn had seemed ordinary to the point of invisibility, now carried weight and meaning. They were evidence, they were proof, they were confirmation that the world still worked, that life continued, that silence had not been permanent after all. The settlers listened to these returning sounds with feelings that were complex and sometimes contradictory. Relief, certainly. Gratitude for the end of isolation, but also, strangely, a kind of loss. The silence had been difficult, yes, uncomfortable, sometimes unbearable, but it had also been simple, clear, honest. Sound brought back complexity, all the demands and expectations and social requirements that acoustic life entailed. Some settlers found themselves reluctant to speak even after sound returned to the world around them. They had grown accustomed to wordlessness, to communicating through gesture and routine, to living inside their own thoughts without the interruption of conversation. The return of sound made speech possible again, but possibility is not the same as desire. Families who had spent months in near silence sometimes struggled to resume talking to each other, not from anger or conflict, but from simple unfamiliarity. They had become strangers to each other's voices, to the rhythms of verbal exchange, to the whole practice of using words to bridge the space between separate minds. Children who had learned quiet during winter sometimes remained quiet afterward, speaking only when necessary, preferring gesture and silence even when sound was freely available. They had adapted young, and adaptation in the young tends to persist. They grew into adults who were known for brevity, for listening more than speaking, for comfort with silence that others found unsettling. As spring advanced and snow melted in earnest, the frontier came back to life acoustically. Rivers ran loud with melt water, their voices powerful after months of frozen silence. Animals emerged from wherever they had hidden through the quiet months, announcing their presence with calls and rustling and the small sounds of creatures pursuing food and mates. Work resumed its seasonal rhythms, and work brought sound, axes splitting wood, saws cutting timber, hammers driving nails. Fields were prepared for planting, and the soil itself made sounds as it was turned and broken, releasing moisture and air that winter had compressed into silence. Neighbors visited again, traveling roads that had been impassable since autumn. Their arrivals brought voices, greetings, the exchange of news and experience. Some settlers welcomed this reconnection eagerly, grateful to rejoin human community. Others found it overwhelming, retreating after brief interactions, needing time to adjust to the acoustic intensity of ordinary social life. The stories they told each other about their winters varied widely. Some focused on practical matters, supplies that had run short, repairs that needed attention, plans for the coming seasons. Others tried to describe the silence itself, though words proved inadequate for capturing something that was fundamentally about the absence of words. It was quiet, they would say, and then pause, knowing this explained nothing, conveyed nothing of what quiet meant when it extended for months, when it became total, when it transformed from temporary condition to permanent reality. Some did not try to explain at all. They simply nodded when others spoke of their winters, offering no details, maintaining even in spring a kind of privacy around the experience of silence. What they had endured felt too personal to share, too strange to describe, too much like something that existed outside normal human experience. The wealthy, emerging from their acoustically rich winters, spoke of confinement and boredom. The soldiers spoke of routine and discipline. The urban dwellers spoke of reduced commerce and social calendars. None of them spoke of silence, because silence had not been part of their experience. When these different groups encountered each other, settler and soldier, isolated homesteader and wealthy townsperson, they discovered they could not quite understand each other's accounts of winter. The seasons they described seemed so different as to be almost unrelated, though they had occurred simultaneously in the same general region. This incomprehension created a kind of loneliness that persisted even after isolation ended. The settlers had endured something that could not be adequately communicated to those who had not endured it. Their experience remained private, sealed away, accessible only to others who had lived through similar silence. But among those others, when they met, there was immediate recognition. They did not need to explain, they simply knew, seeing it in each other's eyes, hearing it in each other's careful, economical speech, recognizing the mark that silence leaves on those it has touched. These quiet recognitions became the basis for new communities, new connections. Settlers who had experienced the deep silence sometimes sought each other out, preferring company that understood without requiring explanation. They built homes near each other, helped each other through subsequent winters, created small acoustic cultures that honored both sound and silence as valid modes of existence. The silence had taught them something about patience, about endurance, about the capacity to continue when external confirmation of existence is removed. This knowledge became valuable in other contexts, in facing hardship, in maintaining hope during difficult times, in understanding that absence is not the same as emptiness. Some became sought after for their calmness, their ability to remain steady when others grew anxious or overwhelmed. The silence had trained them into equanimity, had shown them that existence could continue even when stripped to its barest essentials. This made them valuable companions, reliable neighbors, people who could be trusted not to panic when circumstances became difficult. Others withdrew further into isolation, finding that even the modest noise of small frontier communities felt excessive after months of silence. They built cabins in even more remote locations, chose land that separated them from neighbors by miles rather than minutes. They were not antisocial exactly. They had simply learned to prefer quiet, and once learned, that preference could not be unlearned. The frontier gradually filled with more people, and with more people came more sound. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities. The acoustic isolation that had defined early settlement became increasingly rare, then impossible. Winter remained cold, but it stopped being silent as human density reached the threshold where some level of sound persisted regardless of season. By the time the frontier closed officially, declared settled and civilized by distant governments, the silent winters had become historical curiosities. Old-timers told stories about them, but younger generations found these stories hard to believe. How could winter be that quiet? How could sound simply stop? The stories took on mythological quality, exaggerated in the telling, dismissed as frontier tall tales. The silence became legend rather than history, something that might have happened or might not have, impossible to verify, too strange to accept as literal truth. But the mark of those silent winters persisted in subtle ways, in architectural styles that favored thick walls and small windows long after heating technology made such features unnecessary, in linguistic patterns that valued brevity and understatement, in cultural comfort with silence that distinguished certain regions from others. The descendants of those who had endured the quiet carried forward something of what their ancestors had learned, not consciously perhaps, not with full understanding of its origin, but carried forward nonetheless, embedded in gesture and preference and small choices that seemed personal but were actually cultural, inherited, part of a legacy that traced back to seasons when the world stopped making sound. Today, on the land where those silent winters occurred, life is acoustically rich beyond what any frontier settler could have imagined. Roads carry constant traffic. Towns maintain continuous ambient noise. Even the most rural areas have sounds. Aircraft overhead, distant machinery, the hum of electrical infrastructure. True silence, the kind that settled over the frontier for months at a time, no longer exists in these places. It has been eliminated by human presence, by technology, by the density of settlement that ensures some level of sound persists always. But sometimes, on particularly still winter nights when snow has fallen deep and wind has died completely, something like that old silence returns briefly. Not as total, not as persistent, but present enough to suggest what it might have been like all those years ago when the world could still go truly quiet. In those moments, if you stand very still and listen to the absence of sound, you might feel what the settlers felt, the weight of silence, the strange pressure of soundlessness, the way quiet becomes its own presence, filling the space where noise should be, making itself known through what it is not. And in feeling that, even briefly, you connect across centuries to those who endured the real thing. To Sarah Pritchard, writing her careful letters in a cabin where her voice died within feet of her mouth. To the anonymous settlers who carved geometric patterns into wood during months when speech felt impossible. To all those who learned what it meant to exist when the world forgot how to speak. They are gone now, of course. All of them. The silent winters they endured are gone too, made impossible by the very settlement they helped establish, but something of what they learned remains if you know how to listen for it. Or perhaps more accurately, if you know how to listen for its absence, for the particular quality of quiet that comes not from lack of noise, but from the memory of true silence, patient and profound, and waiting always in the spaces between sounds. The frontier has closed, the settlements have become cities, the silence has been filled with traffic and voices and all the acoustic chaos of modern existence. But underneath it all, beneath the noise, there remains an echo of that older quiet, not audible, exactly, but present nonetheless, like a note sustained so long it becomes silence, like a memory carried in the land itself. And on the stillest winter nights, when snow falls thick and wind forgets to blow, you can almost hear it. Not the silence itself, but its possibility. The reminder that sound, for all its seeming permanence, is actually fragile, temporary, easily lost. That quiet waits always, patient and ready, for the moment when the world might once again grow still. The settlers knew this. They learned it through endurance, through months of living beyond sound's reach. They emerged from their silent winters carrying that knowledge forward, unable to fully explain it, but unable to forget it either. And now, as you lie in your own warmth and comfort, surrounded by the gentle hum of modern life, you carry something of their experience too. You have drifted with them through their silence, felt something of their isolation, understood, however briefly, what it meant to live when sound ceased. Perhaps you will sleep now, having travelled so far into quiet. Perhaps you will dream of snow and stillness, of small cabins in vast wilderness, of seasons when the world held its breath for months at a time. Or perhaps you will simply rest, letting the story settle into memory, joining all the other stories that live in the spaces between waking and sleep, between sound and silence, between the life we live and the lives we imagine. The settlers would understand. They knew about drifting, about the soft boundary between consciousness and its absence. They spent months in that liminal space, existing without quite living, enduring without quite experiencing, present but distant, there but not entirely there. And so as this quiet journey ends, as the story returns you to your own time and place, remember them. Remember the silence they endured. Remember what they learned in that silence and what they carried forward from it. Remember that sound is precious because it can be lost. That connection matters because isolation is possible. That the world we take for granted, full of voices and music and all the acoustic richness of human community, is not inevitable, but rather maintained, sustained, chosen each day over the silence that waits always at the edges of human life. The frontier winters taught this lesson. The silence made it clear. And though those winters are gone and that silence no longer settles over settled land, the lesson remains quiet and patient, waiting to be heard by those who know how to listen. So rest now. Let the quiet hold you. Let the story fade into the gentle hum of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the small sounds that prove you exist in warmth and safety, surrounded by sound, protected from the silence that once defined winter on the frontier. Rest and dream of snow and stillness, of small acoustic events made precious by their rarity, of lives lived at the edge of silence, enduring what must be endured, continuing because continuation is all there is. Rest and let the quiet ease you into sleep, that temporary silence we all seek, that brief escape from sound and demand, and the constant acoustic presence of the world. Rest now. The silence is waiting, and you are safe within it, safe and warm, and drifting toward sleep, carrying with you the memory of those who drifted before, in colder times, in deeper quiet, in winters when the world forgot to speak, and humans learned to listen to the sound of nothing at all. Rest. Sleep. Let the quiet hold you. The story is complete. The silence remains. And you are safely held within it, as those settlers once were, as all of us are when we finally stop listening and simply let go. Good night.